I'm not an expert at characterizing plaque at a microscopic detail, but what I did appreciate was the description of what seemed to be not only relatively conventional looking artery narrowings, plaque buildup that we all will eventually get in our arteries, but also in one of the arteries it was described that there was an element of calcium. And I only mention that because that also indicates that this coronary artery disease didn't just kind of develop right away. It was probably a slow, gradual buildup of the narrowings, and that actually is a very clinically relevant finding in the field of cardiology.
Doctor, did you make any assessments around the size of Mr. Floyd's heart?
Yes, I did.
Would you tell the jury about that?
Sure. So when looking at the size of his heart, not just the size, but the thickness of the heart, it was described as being mildly thick or mildly enlarged. Now, depending on which criteria you use, one criteria would agree with that it was mildly thick or enlarged. Others would suggest that it was in the normal range. I do believe that it was likely mildly thick and mildly enlarged. It is an expected finding in somebody that has high blood pressure. So even though there are some scoring systems that might say it wasn't even enlarged at all, in my view as a cardiologist, I do believe there was just the smallest element of increased heart thickness. And as I mentioned before, that's important because that's exactly what the heart is supposed to do when there's high blood pressure. That is a normal response. The muscle's getting stronger, it's allowing the heart to work and work well. Now, if that goes on for, like I said before, 20 years, we can have problems, but early on, having a mildly thickened heart is not only a normal finding in someone with high blood pressure, it may actually be beneficial in the short term.
Doctor, putting all this together, did you see any evidence at all that the primary cause of Mr. Floyd's death originated in his heart?
No, I did not.
Let's talk about a new subject. Whether or not Mr. Floyd suffered from a drug overdose and died from a drug overdose.
Okay.
That was something that you also considered as a cause.
Yes, sir.
Were you or are you familiar with Mr. Floyd's toxicology results?
Yes, I am.
What or which substances did you consider in evaluating Mr. Floyd's toxicology history?
When I looked at the toxicology reports, I focused mostly on the finding of fentanyl as well as the finding of methamphetamines.
What role, if any, do you feel that the fentanyl played in the cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
As far as I can tell from reviewing all of the facts of the case, I see no evidence at all to suggest that a fentanyl overdose caused Mr. Floyd's death.
As cardiologists, do you occasionally have to care for patients who struggle with opioids or opioid addiction?
Absolutely.
So here you found that the fentanyl, in your opinion, played no role in Mr. Floyd's death. Would you tell us why it is you hold that opinion? How do you reach that conclusion?
Well, I think I would break it down to just two major reasonings. Number one, it appeared to me that Mr. Floyd, who was an acknowledged frequent chronic user of substances, particularly opiates, likely developed a high degree of tolerance. There's even one emergency room visit that I had reviewed where he came in and he told the emergency room team that he was tearful and says, "I'm having trouble with substance abuse. I think he said I took 8 Percocets within 2 hours. He had no side effects from that at all. They observed him for a couple hours and they discharged him." And just so looking through it looked like he had built up a high tolerance just in general to opiates. But the second, and just as important, maybe more important, was I didn't see any of the signs of an opiate overdose when I reviewed the videos.
And when then I'm referring to the signs of an opiate overdose, Would you tell the jurors or describe for them what are those signs and what didn't you see?
Sure. So in my experience in the intensive care unit, taking care of patients who come in with an opiate overdose, first of all, they are usually extremely lethargic, oftentimes nearly unarousable. And then you try to wake them up and they're falling right back asleep. They're not talking to you. If they are talking to you, they're often having slurred speech. If they're standing up, which they wouldn't be if they had a fentanyl intoxication and overdose, they would have to imagine get pretty dizzy pretty quickly. I kind of saw all the opposite with Mr. Floyd. I saw that he was alert, he was awake, he was conversant, he was walking, and yet, according to the toxicology report, he had this degree of fentanyl in his system. So just looking at the clinical story, I didn't see any signs or symptoms of fentanyl overdose.
Let's turn to methamphetamine then. What role do you feel that methamphetamine played in Mr. Floyd's cause of death?
I feel it played no substantive role at all.
And why is that?
Well, all considering, it was a very relatively low level of methamphetamine in his system. And so when you look at the context of the case and you see a relatively low level of methamphetamine in the context of everything else, I felt very confident that that low degree of methamphetamine was not what was triggering this profound
when you feel measures could have or should have been taken that would have preserved his life?
Yes, I do. I think there were several junctures, actually.
Would you tell us about those?
Sure. Well, the first, of course, was to not subject him to that initial prone restraint positioning that he was subjected to. I mean, that is first and foremost. So if that was not the case, I don't think he would have died. The second, though, was when he was in that subdual and restraint positioning, and he was stating repeatedly that he can't breathe, and he was getting a little weaker in his speech. There was one moment in the video where I heard one of the officers saying, I think he's passing out. That would have been an opportunity to quickly relieve him from that position of not getting enough oxygen, perhaps turn him into a recovery position and allow him to start to expand his lungs again and bring in oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. So in addition to not putting him in that position in the first place, when there were signs that he was worsening, repositioning him, I think very likely would have also saved his life.
Was there a point in time, Dr. Rich, when Mr. Floyd was checked for a pulse when he was in the subdual and the restraint of Mr. Chauvin?
Yes, there was.
At the time that he was checked for a pulse and he no longer had one, in your opinion as a cardiologist, was there anything Mr. Chauvin could have done at that point in time that would likely have saved Mr. Floyd's life? Well, at the time that Mr. Floyd is determined to have not had a pulse, what is your opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, as to what Mr. Chauvin may have done that would have potentially saved his life?
Overruled. You can give an opinion.
Well, just prior to that point, I heard one of the officers actually ask, actually on 2 occasions, if Mr. Floyd should be turned onto his side. And the response was, no, just leave him. And once the officer announced that he did not have a pulse anymore, I think he actually said he does not have one, was the exact words. At that point, the immediate response would then be to not only relieve him of the restraint, but at that point now you've got to start CPR. You've got to start immediate chest compressions, because we know that if you can get to a patient right away, even when they've lost their pulse, even when they've gone into a cardiopulmonary arrest, there is a significant opportunity to save a life. But for every minute that transpires that you are not performing the basic life support and CPR measures, the literature would suggest an approximately 10 to 15% less chance of survival. It is why we pour so many resources these days into community education and training for bystander CPR, because it's so effective and it works if the person can be tended to quickly enough.
Then from your review of the video, where you could see Mr. Floyd and Mr. Chauvin there on the ground, if Mr. Chauvin knew CPR, did you see any reason from your observation that he could not have supplied CPR?
Not within the opinion, medical opinion, so that is sustained.
I'm sorry, Your Honor.
Sustained.
All right.
It's not a medical opinion, counsel.
So at the time then that Mr. Floyd was actually put into the ambulance from the scene, in your opinion as a cardiologist, what would have been the prospects of resuscitating him at that point?
Overruled. You may give an opinion if you have one.
So at that point, I think the chance of meaningful survival, unfortunately, was very low, because I counted the number of minutes that he was on the ground, pulseless, without any CPR. And by the time the paramedics rushed in to get him, and to get him onto the stretcher and into the back of the ambulance, at that point, a lot of time had passed. I give tremendous credit to the efforts of the paramedics and the doctors and nurses in the emergency room. I mean, they worked on him for what seemed...
Sustained. This is non-responsive.
Dr. Rich, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd would have lived if not for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of subdual and restraint?
Objection.
Overruled if you have an opinion.
Let me finish my question for you, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether George Floyd would have lived if not for Mr. Chauvin's subdual and restraint of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on the ground?
Yeah.
Overruled. Give an opinion if you have one. For a reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Yes, I believe he would have lived.
Last question, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether a completely healthy George Floyd, that is, any healthy human being, would have survived the subdual and restraint that Mr. Floyd suffered during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of 2020?
Objection calls for speculation.
It's sustained is irrelevant as to a general person.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Sustained.
My question for you, Dr. Rich, is would any person, a healthy person, have survived the circumstances or conditions that George Floyd underwent during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of last year?
Same objection.
Sustained.
No further questions, Dr. Rich.
Thank you.
Members of the jury, let's take our 20-minute mid-morning recess. Let's come back at 11:25. Thank you.
If Mr. Floyd is in a PEA state, or generally anyone, is PEA reversible?
So it is important to put it into context. So we see PEA cardiac arrests in the hospital all the time. Whenever you see a PEA cardiac arrest, you rush to it, of course, and you begin the protocol. And that protocol is the H's and the T's. And so you give oxygen if you don't think they have enough oxygen. I mean, that's the most critical thing to do. Depending on the other H's, for example, hypovolemia or hemorrhage. If you think they're bleeding out from a trauma, you would rush and give them blood. And we're doing these things, of course, simultaneously because time is of the essence. So we resuscitate patients with cardiopulmonary arrest from PEA not infrequently. Unfortunately, PEA can also be a devastating cardiac arrest, and despite all of our best abilities, sometimes it's not reversible.
Dr. Rich, did you see any evidence at all that George Floyd had had a heart attack?
No, none whatsoever.
What about this notion of something called a silent heart attack?
A silent heart attack. Well, so a silent heart attack, a silent heart attack is sometimes referred if it looks like someone might have had a heart attack, but there were no clinical signs to suggest it. It's a relatively uncommon finding. It tends to happen in patients who have diabetes, because when you have diabetes, one of the problems with diabetes is you lose some sensation in the nerve endings. And so typically when you're having a heart attack, you'll see people clutch their chest. Oh my God, I'm having chest pressure, chest pain. Sometimes diabetics won't have that, and it's possible that they can have a silent heart attack. But there was no evidence that Mr. Floyd had any type of heart attack, a silent heart attack or a non-silent heart attack.
And so you talked about this a little bit, about the notion of a cardiac arrhythmia, the fluttering of the heart. I think you referred to as either the VFs or the VTs,
Yeah.
ventricular fibrillation or ventricular tachycardia.
Right.
Was there any evidence that he'd had either one of those?
No, there was no evidence that he had any of those.
When somebody is suffering from ventricular fibrillation or tachycardia, did you describe that as what we might refer to as a sudden death event?
Yes, so ventricular fibrillation can certainly cause sudden cardiac death. That absolutely could be described as that.
And again, in viewing Mr. Floyd and his encounter on the videos from May 25th, did Mr. Floyd die a sudden death?
Mr. Floyd died a gradual death. It would not be considered the classic sudden death from the standpoint of how you're putting into that context, meaning when people have that ventricular fibrillation, that VF arrest, they literally go from being fine one moment to completely out the next. I don't know what happened. I was sitting next to him and he keeled over and was on the ground, and then that could have been a VF arrest. So sometimes there's semantics in terms of this, but in the case of Mr. Floyd, yes, he did have a cardiopulmonary arrest, but no, he did not. There was no evidence of a sudden cardiac death from VFib or any other malignant heart arrhythmia.
Okay, so we've talked about your review of the medical records, and we've talked about your review of the video. The third thing you said you reviewed was the autopsy report and findings.
Yes.
What were you looking for with respect to the autopsy report and findings?
Sure. So we're talking about the autopsy report here towards the end. I actually looked at the autopsy report first, then I went back to the medical records that we've already talked about in the videos, and then I went back to the autopsy again. So what I was looking for in the autopsy was, well, first of all, everything. When we get an autopsy, oftentimes you'll get it because you're looking, could there be something that we weren't aware of that could have happened? But in addition to looking at all the findings, my major focus, of course, as a cardiologist, was anything and everything related to the heart.
good paying jobs, and grow our economy. On the screens behind me, you'll see some of the needs outlined and the tangible difference the jobs plan will make in improving the lives of Americans. So for a few highlights here, from 2010 to 2020, Florida has experienced 22 extreme weather events, costing the state up to $100 billion in damages. The president is calling for $50 billion to improve the resiliency of our infrastructure. Of course, there are many states across the country that have had weather events and have been impacted, but this is just one of the examples. In Michigan, there are more than 1,200 bridges and over 7,300 miles of highway in poor conditions. That's clearly an area that could benefit from funding, including the $115 billion for repairing roads and bridges in the plan. In South Dakota, 13% of South Dakotans do not have access to acceptable broadband speeds. That's something we'd love to improve. Why there's $100 billion to propose to bring universal, reliable, high-speed, and affordable coverage to every family. And in Nevada, finally, 243,000 renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent. One of the reasons we've proposed, the president has proposed, investing over $200 billion to increase housing supply. So they're state by state. You should all have them, but what they really do is identify the needs in these states and how this package could benefit. As we've talked about a bit in here, there are different types of funding for infrastructure that would be worked through with Congress as the discussions proceed. Finally, I also wanted to highlight a significant win for American workers in the American auto industry over the weekend, late Saturday night into Sunday morning. As you know, a key part of the president's Build Back Better plan includes a significant increase in the number of electric vehicles and batteries built here in America. We need a strong, diversified, and resilient U.S.-based electric vehicle battery supply chain so we can meet the growing global demand for these vehicles and components. And the settlement we announced over the weekend, or I should say was announced by USTR and others, by SK Innovation and LG, is a positive step that builds confidence in their reliability and responsibility as suppliers to the U.S. auto industry. It's great news for many people in the country, including people of Georgia and other states that are impacted a great deal by this issue. With that, Alex, kick us off.
Thanks, Jen. I wanted to ask about the attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. Is there concern within the White House that this will derail ongoing talks to reestablish the Iran nuclear deal? And has there been any effort by the administration to reach out through intermediaries or any other way to Tehran and make clear that the U.S. wasn't involved in these attacks, or in the attack?
Well, we of course have seen the reports of the incident at the Natanz enrichment facility. The U.S. was not involved in any manner. We have nothing to add on speculation about the causes or the impacts. I will say on your first question, though, we are focused on the discussions that we expect to proceed this Wednesday in Vienna. To the diplomatic discussions that have been taking place and took place last week. We expect them to be difficult and long. We have not been given any indication about a change in participation for these discussions.
And then with respect to the semiconductor summit, are there any actions the White House or the federal government can take immediately to address the chip shortage, or is this just the kind of thing that you need reforms and more funding for? And then does the president see the shortage as a national security issue?
We certainly do. I will say there are a number of steps that we believe we can take as a federal government. We believe there needs to be a holistic, long-term, across-government approach. In the near term, we're engaging with industry, as is evidenced by the meeting that's taking place shortly, later this afternoon, as well as our international partners to ensure that American companies are operating on an even playing field. Even before this this meeting today, I should say, we have also proposed major investments. That's something we feel the federal government could also do. We've called on Congress to invest $50 billion in semiconductor manufacturing and research, as called for in the Bipartisan CHIPS Act. We have also called for additional funding there's also bipartisan proposals, I should say, like an investment of $50 billion in the National Science Foundation, which would create a technology directorate that will focus on fields like semiconductors and advanced computing to help increase our competitiveness at home. So our view is that this is certainly something where we need to work closely with industry. We need to work closely with Congress, Democrats and Republicans. There's agreement on this issue being one that's impacting industries across the country, also with allies and partners, and how we can prevent this shortage from happening in the future. Go ahead.
Thank you, Jen. Just to follow up on the chip shortage and sort of short-term solutions.
Yeah.
Any conversations perhaps with chip manufacturers, like for example, Samsung, to prioritize U.S. orders for automakers, or any thoughts on perhaps getting rid of regulations that'll help kick in supplies for automakers? Any sense of what you can do now?
Well, one of the reasons the president is stopping by this meeting that our National Security Advisor and our NEC Director are holding this afternoon is to hear directly from companies about the impacts, what would help them most through this period of time, and the shortage that, as you all have reported on, has impacted a range of industries across the country. So this isn't a meeting where we expect a decision or an announcement to come out of, but a part of our ongoing engagement and discussion about how to best address this issue over the long term, but also over the short term.
Okay, and a couple of questions on immigration. We understand that there was an agreement with Honduras, Mexico, and Guatemala to place more troops at the border. And we understand that the Vice President was able to secure these commitments and have seen some numbers on, how many troops will be placed at these borders. But when were these agreements struck? And if you can just give us any sense of what this plan really entails.
Well, there have been a series of bilateral discussions between our leadership and the regional governments of Mexico, Honduras, and Guatemala. Through those discussions, there was a commitment, as you mentioned, to increase border security. So Mexico made the decision to maintain 10,000 troops at its southern border, resulting in twice as many daily migrant interdictions. Guatemala surged 1,500 police and military personnel to its southern border with Honduras and agreed to set up 12 checkpoints along the migratory route. Honduras surged 7,000 police and military to disperse a large contingent of migrants. As with any diplomatic discussion, these discussions happen at several levels. And certainly, as you know, we have an envoy who has discussions with the region. We've had Roberta Jacobson working for a period of time to help have these discussions with the region about what steps can be taken to help reduce the number of migrants who are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border.
To characterize it as these agreements were struck recently, and in the past few weeks, would it be fair to say that?
I think that's fair to say, but I would also say that often these discussions are ongoing over a period of time and take place at several levels of the government, both here and within these countries.
And is the plan to sort of apprehend these migrants who are trying to cross the border, or sort of as they're already on their way to the United States, is the plan to sort of, stop them there? How will this work?
You'd have to speak with these countries about how they will be implementing. I think the objective is to make it more difficult to make the journey and make crossing the borders more difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Kelly.
On Minnesota and another officer-involved shooting that resulted in the death of an African-American man, has the White House been in touch with Governor Walz, or are there any resources from the federal government that are being offered? And this comes at a time when obviously the Chauvin trial is progressing. Is there a federal plan for when that trial reaches its conclusion, whatever the outcome may be? And thirdly, I'm racing through them because we're short on time today. The president had promised as a candidate a police commission that Dr. Rice says will not go forward at this time. It seems obviously that officer-involved interactions with the public are intensely important at the moment. So first on Minnesota, and if you could address the police commission going forward.
Sure, and just check me if I don't get to all of your questions. I will try to do my best. Let me first say that we are incredibly saddened. We were incredibly saddened to hear about the loss of life at the hands of law enforcement in Minnesota yesterday. The president has, of course, been briefed. He will have a few words he will share at the top of the semiconductor event that will be starting shortly. Hence, we'll be moving through our questions here about his own thoughts. We are also in touch with the governor, in touch with the mayor, in touch with local law enforcement authorities as well. I would say it is a reminder of the pain, the anger, the trauma, the exhaustion that many communities across the country have felt as we see these incidents continue to occur within just a few miles of where the tragic events happened just a year ago. In terms of the police commission, we have been in very close contact over the course of several months back to the transition with both civil rights activists, with law enforcement authorities and the law enforcement community about what would be most effective moving forward. And as Dr. Rice conveyed, or I think the statement we put out, I should say, conveyed, we have made a decision in coordination that the best path forward is to work to pass the George Floyd Policing Act. That has a great deal of the content, of the policy changes, of the necessary reforms that we would all like to see in place. So that was a collective decision, and that's where our focus will be.
And is this a delay, or do you expect it to just not go forward at all?
Well, we expect, for the time being, for our focus to be on moving the legislation forward and not on the Policing Commission. Go ahead.
You mentioned, the focus is now on passing the George Floyd Policing Act. It's been over a month since we've heard the president talk about this, though. We haven't seen a big push, at least not publicly, from this administration. What kind of steps are you taking to pressure Congress on this, and should we expect to see this sort of rise on the list of your priorities? You obviously have a very full plate.
We do, but I would say that the president was addressing racial equity, ensuring that we are putting in place long overdue reforms. Real change is a priority for him. It is something he looks forward to continuing to discuss with members of Congress. He believes that there is a path forward, that this piece of legislation offers that path forward, and he certainly will use the power of his presidency to move it forward.
You mentioned that civil rights groups recommended against this commission. Did they put forth other recommendations, steps that the White House can take while you try and pressure Congress, wait, and hope that the Senate will act on them?
Well, we, of course, are in very close touch with them. I think what is, I should say more specifically, we've been in touch with a range of groups, including the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Leadership Conference, as well as leading experts. And the strong consensus from all of these groups is that the work should be focused on trying to pass the George Floyd Act, and the commission would not be the most constructive way to deliver on our top priorities. So we are working together collectively to do exactly that. There are steps that we certainly will work in conjunction to take as they are possible, and some of them we've signed through executive orders, and we'll continue to communicate with these groups about what is most effective.
Just quickly on infrastructure, the president is having this bipartisan meeting today, but what is your message to some congressional Republicans who have expressed skepticism about whether the White House is authentically interested in negotiating here, given how things played out with the COVID relief bill?
Well, I would say that the president, you don't use the president of the United States' time multiple times over, including 2 infrastructure meetings, bipartisan infrastructure meetings he's already had, or the meeting today, if he did not want to authentically hear from the members attending about their ideas about how to move forward this package in a bipartisan manner.
So is he willing to negotiate on the scope and the price tag, or just on ways to pay for this?
He absolutely is. He looks forward to hearing their ideas, and his objective is to find a way forward where we can modernize our nation's infrastructure so we can compete with China. He's proposed a way to pay for it, which is what he thinks the responsible thing is to do, and he hopes they'll come to the table with ideas. Go ahead, Josh.
I get asked for an update. On March 18th, you said that there was a stockpile of 7 million AstraZeneca doses, some of which were loaned to the Canadians and Mexicans. Can you give us a current number and say whether the president is considering sending more either to those countries or other countries?
I don't have anything to predict in terms of sharing the stockpile at this point. I can assure you that we don't want that stockpile to expire. And obviously, we don't have control over the FDA approval process, but I don't have anything more to preview for you at this point.
When the first made doses that are in that stockpile would expire? How much
I'm
more
happy.
weight is there?
I'm happy to check for you, Josh, and see if there's more we can share. And AstraZeneca themselves, of course, could share more details probably.
Does the White House know whether any U.S.-made shots have left U.S. soil other than those loans? In other words, shots made on U.S. soil but not for the U.S. government?
From the companies?
Yeah, correct. So can the companies sell, export currently, as long as they're meeting their U.S. obligations?
I think that's a question about their contracts. Obviously, we've had this discussion before. There's an obligation under certain contracts to deliver on the commitments made in the contract with the U.S. government, especially when the Defense Production Act has been invoked. But I would send you to the companies for that question.
Okay. Can I ask just a couple of personnel things? You mentioned Roberta Jacobson. Why did she make the decision to step down from that post? And can you say whether it's accurate that Cindy McCain is being considered for the UN Food Ambassador Program post?
Sure. On the first, I would say it was always Ambassador Jacobson's intention to stay for about 100 days. She's been a diplomat serving in a range of roles around the world, from ambassador to Mexico to assistant secretary for WHA for decades. And she is retiring, as she deserves, as she has certainly paid her time to do. And so that was always her intention, to stay for a period of time. In that period of time, of course, we have also announced the naming of an envoy, Ricardo Zuniga, who has played a prominent role in the Western Hemisphere in the past for the U.S. government. He'll be playing that role. The president's asked the vice president to play an elevated role in engagements and negotiations with the Northern Triangle, hence our earlier discussion about her role there and the path forward there. So there are a range of officials who will continue to do this work. We were fortunate to have the work and the expertise and experience of Ambassador Jacobson as long as we have. There is an ongoing process on ambassadors. I know that there's a lot of eagerness and interest in learning more. It's ongoing. The president has not made the decision about the vast majority of his ambassadorial nominations.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Jen. President Biden has made very clear that two of his top priorities for the infrastructure plan is to create jobs and to stimulate the economy. Last night on 60 Minutes, Jerome Powell said he and other forecasters already see that happening. So I wonder if the optimistic outlook changes the president's priorities in the plan at all and offers more wiggle room for negotiation in certain areas.
Do you mean we don't need as many jobs?
The goal of the plan is to create jobs and stimulate the economy, and they're saying that's already happening, which is a great thing. So is he willing to scale back on some of these items because we're already seeing growth?
Well, I unfortunately, I regularly watch 60 Minutes. I did not see the whole episode, so I don't know the whole context of his remarks. But I will say that part of what economists feel is that we are still behind, that we need to still do more. Because if you look at our last jobs report, we were still about 8.4 million jobs in the red, that we needed to create, that we needed to Americans we needed to put back to work. There's still parts of the American population, high levels of unemployment among African Americans, Latino Americans, Asian Americans, that we need to work to address. This is definitely a jobs package, hence the American Jobs Plan. But what it also does is it helps modernize, invest in our nation's infrastructure, and do that in a way that will help us compete over the long term and help us have jobs for the future. So there are many objectives of this package, but certainly we feel there is more work to be done to put more Americans back to work, and we are not in the clear on that front.
You. And on the state-by-state fact sheets that you released this morning, can you just share how that process happened, including who was involved in putting together the state-by-state reports, and what the metrics were to assign that final grade for each state?
Well, it was done by a collection of smart and brilliant people on our economic team that you probably wouldn't necessarily identify on the street, but sounds like a good profile piece to me. But they work to identify what the needs are in the states. I don't know that I have the exact process to outline for you, but maybe you can
work with state officials and local departments as well to decide what each state needs.
What the needs are. I'm happy to check and see if there's more about the process that we can share.
Okay, great. Thank
Sure.
you.
Go ahead.
Yes, you talked about paying for the infrastructure bill. Is the president set on raising the corporate tax rate as the way to do that, even though Republicans are saying it's a red line, or is that also open to negotiation?
It's all open to negotiation, but I will say that having corporations pay their fair share, raising the rate to a rate that is still lower than it has been, aside from a few years since World War II, the president feels is an entirely reasonable, appropriate, effective way to pay for this package. There are other proposals that have been put out there, including user fees. The president doesn't feel that we should pay for this package on the backs of the American people, but he's certainly eager to hear ideas from Democrats and Republicans on alternatives.
And then, Senator John Cornyn called Joe Biden's tweets unimaginably conventional and said that his comments were largely scripted and questioned whether he was really in charge. Does the White House have any reaction to that?
Well, I can confirm that the President of the United States does not spend his time tweeting conspiracy theories. He spends his time working on behalf of the American people. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead. Josh, you went. Go ahead.
Help me first?
Yep, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Jen. So just to piggyback off of on the corporate tax rate,
Yeah.
Senator Manchin said that he only supports raising it to 25%, that that's his line in the sand. What's the White House response to that? And has the President or Secretary Buttigieg spoken to Manchin about that corporate tax rate?
Well, we are in regular touch with a range of officials, senators, members of Congress. There have been dozens and dozens of meetings and briefings. I don't have a specific readout of our engagements with Senator Manchin. I'm sure he could share that with all of you. But I would say that we're certainly encouraged to hear that Senator Manchin is open to raising the corporate tax rate as a means of potentially paying for a historic investment in our nation's infrastructure, and most importantly, to creating jobs. And the president is happy to hear ideas or alternatives for how this plan and package should be paid for. His primary focus is on this investment, on creating jobs, on helping put back to work the millions of men and women who don't have college degrees, on ensuring we're evening the playing field, on doing what we can to compete with China over the long term. There are disagreements about how to pay for it. We're happy to have a discussion about that.
And then two more quickly. There appears to be a large deployment of Russian land forces towards the border with Ukraine. What is the administration prepared to do if Russia moves to invade eastern Ukraine?
Well, first let me say we are concerned, as I've said in the past, but we've been, of course, watching it over the course of the weekend about the increasing aggression of Russian forces on the border. Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin are in Brussels this week, meeting with their NATO partners, and we will, of course, I'm sure this will be a topic of discussion. We also remain in touch with Ukrainian officials at a range of levels, but I'm not going to get ahead of their discussions that they're having on the ground.
And then just on police reform again, you mentioned on Friday that the president is meeting with the CBC tomorrow. Is police reform going to be the topic of discussion? Criminal justice reform? What exactly will they be discussing?
I'm sure there'll be a range of issues discussed. The primary purpose from our perspective is to discuss the American Jobs Plan and how to move that forward. But as is always the case, there will be a range of topics we expect discussed during the meeting.
Do we have to gather? It's 12:45.
I think it's 1 o'clock. 12:55. Okay, 10 more minutes. Alex is so responsible for keeping track. She is. Yeah, go ahead.
When can we expect to see the president announce the American Family Plan that was supposed to be coming soon? When can we look for that? Also, there's some talk about making the expanded child care tax credit permanent. Or is the administration looking at extending it or making it permanent at this point?
So the president believes there's a huge benefit of the child tax credit. That's why he put the child tax credit in his ARP, American Rescue Plan, because he feels it's important, it's vital. It will help get the 2 million women who are out of work back to work, hopefully back into the workforce. You'll hear more on the American Families Plan in the coming weeks, but I don't have an exact date for you quite yet.
Nothing on whether or not the administration is considering making it permanent or just extending it?
I don't have anything more to preview for you on the American Families Plan, although just to reiterate, the president believes the child tax credit is a way to help American families and especially all of the working moms out there who are trying to make ends meet. Go ahead.
Me?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I want to follow up on a question I asked, I feel like it's a month ago now.
It may have been.
The New York Times last week came out with a story that Mississippi was having a hard time getting folks vaccinated, but it's not just Mississippi. It's a bunch of other rural states, Ohio, Oklahoma. They're at 34% vaccination rate. Even so, opening up vaccines to out-of-staters. I know we talked a little bit about before the preliminary steps. Has the White House been in touch with these governors to see what they can do now? Because of course this impacts herd immunity and the goals of the White House just to get these shots in on.
Well, there are a number of steps that we've taken in the recent weeks, including launching the Community Corps, which is our program to provide fact-based messages into the hands of local messengers. So we're now working with more than 4,000 organizations that have signed up so far across the country, including in a number of the states that you mentioned. We're also investing $3 billion to states and community-based organizations to strengthen vaccine confidence in the highest risk and hardest hit communities. And often people think of that as just Black and brown communities, and that is not. As you've noted, that is also conservative communities, white evangelicals. It's a range of communities around the country. What we found to be most effective is to work with these local organizations. So faith-based organizations, community health organizations, civic leaders, and others who can really get this message deeply in communities. We've also had a number of our members of our COVID team, from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins, participate in a range of media interviews. You know, an example is Dr. Collins participated in the 700 Club. Dr. Nunez-Smith hosted a faith leaders roundtable. We're also we've run PSAs on the deadliest catch. We're engaged with NASCAR and Country Music TV. We're looking for a range of creative ways to get directly connected to white conservative communities. We won't always be the best messengers, but we're still trying to meet people where they are, but also empower local organizations.
And just quick follow-up, does the White House endorse these states opening up their vaccines to folks from out of state? You know, these do expire, so that rather than them sitting on the shelf, they're going to go to somebody else.
Well, these states are all going to have their own implementation plans, and we certainly work with them to advise how to distribute the vaccines as equitably as possible and as effectively and efficiently around states. No state is 100% vaccinated, as we know. So our focus has been working with them on how to get them to the communities that are the hardest hit. Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks. So why hasn't President Biden signed the presidential determination that would lift former President Trump's immigration policies, including the 15,000 person refugee cap?
It's an issue he remains committed to, as he announced. I just don't have an update on the signing of the paperwork.
Okay. And equity was cited as the reason for which the White House decided against surging vaccines to Michigan. The administration is surging FEMA vaccinators. What makes the vaccine different?
Well, I think it's important to understand how we've approached vaccine distribution from the beginning. It's done with equity in mind. It's done with the population, the adult population in mind. We don't pick by our friends. We don't pick through a political prism. We pick through what is most effective to be fair and equitable around the country. We also made an announcement during the transition that we were not going to hold on to a big supply. We distribute and get the supply out as quickly as possible. So that's why our focus is on working with states like Michigan to surge testing, surge tracing, surge the distribution of therapeutics, areas where we have the ability to provide additional help, additional resources, but we're not in a place, nor will we be, where we take supply from one state to give it to another.
Okay, I see.
Go ahead.
Follow up on Brittany's question about vaccines. Do you think that the White House has had any part in this, in having a sort of maybe pessimistic message towards some Americans who are skeptical of this administration, who for partisan reasons or otherwise, to see vaccinated people in the cabinet or the president continuing to wear masks around each other, or hearing that things won't be back to normal as the vaccine continues to be distributed? Do you think that that is having a negative effect at all?
On people, make sure I understand your question. On people not taking the vaccine?
Yeah, people who are skeptical of the vaccine and who don't trust the Biden administration.
Well, look, I think, one, we recognize we're not always the best messengers. That's why we're working with these local organizations and groups, because we certainly know that President Biden and Vice President Harris may not be the right voices in a range of communities across the country. Two, we believe that part of our objective is to model public health guidelines, and that means continuing to wear masks, continuing to hand wash, social distance, because there is still ongoing research on what is most effective and how to prevent distribution and the pandemic traveling further. So I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. Maybe.
How do you strike that balance between being a model of the public health guidelines and also not contributing to this sense of hopelessness, perhaps, among people who are skeptical of getting a vaccine and maybe feel like getting it would not make a difference in their lives anyway?
Sure. yeah, I think a big part of what we're trying to do is provide accurate information about what getting a vaccine will enable the American people to do. Hence, the president gave a primetime address where he said, when the vaccine's accessible to you and you get it, we can work towards having backyard barbecues. We've also had a number of officials out there to convey, and we've had, obviously the CDC has put out guidance that says, if you're vaccinated, if your neighbors are vaccinated, you can have dinner inside together. It's a pandemic. We don't think it's easy. We know it's difficult. It's required a lot of sacrifice. But at the same time, we're trying to provide accurate public health-based guidance on what people can do once they have taken the vaccine. Go ahead in the back.
Thank you very much, Jen. To East Asia question, if I
Okay.
may. On John Kerry's potential visit to Shanghai, what's President Biden's expectation of that?
Of John Kerry's visit?
To Shanghai.
Well, certainly he'll be focused on discussing climate and how we can work with leaders around the region to get control of the climate crisis. But I would send you to the State Department because that's where he works.
And also on the CHIP summit, according to South Korea media, Korea Economic Daily, quote, industry watchers say following this White House meeting, Samsung may be forced to make a decision on its new U.S. factory sooner and build a production line for automotive chips, given the dire shortage of such chips in the United States.
Well, I know we'll put out a readout after the meeting, but the purpose of the meeting is really to consult with these business leaders about how we can help address the shortage. Let me just get around to the back, and then I know you have to gather soon.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Iran, immigration, they're all follow-ups. On Iran, the foreign minister is vowing revenge against Israel for its alleged attack on its nuclear facilities. Israel's not denied this. How concerned is the White House, is the president, that the actions of an ally potentially may be derailing efforts by the White House to get Iran back into compliance under the JCPOA?
Well, I think I answered a version of this question earlier, but let me try again.
We haven't talked about it.
Well, again, we've seen the reports. We don't have anything more to speak to as it relates to the causes or who is responsible. Our focus is, of course, on the diplomatic path forward. We have not been given any indication that attendance at the discussions and that will proceed on Wednesday has changed. So that's where our focus is.
But is there concern that the actions of an ally are derailing the U.S.
I think I've
efforts?
answered your question. Did you have another one?
I didn't think it was an answer.
Okay. I'm sorry to hear that. I've answered it a couple times.
Okay, let me just quickly follow up.
Okay.
And, let me try on Ukraine. The Secretary of State said that there will be consequences if Russia continues its escalation along the border. Can you give us a sense of what those range of options are? And then also, at what level does this escalation require President Biden to reach out to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I would say that what we've long said is that there will be some consequences that are seen and some that are unseen. I'm not going to give you a menu of the options. When we're ready to announce them, we will announce them and share the details with all of you.
Very quickly on immigration.
Okay.
With regard to the militarization of the borders in Central America, the agreements that have been secured, did the White House in any way secure any, or is the White House concerned, given the record number of children that have been making this trek, that they are at greater risk given the fact that these are soldiers, not daycare workers?
Well, I think the objective is to deter the journey. And so that's why our discussions with these countries involved increasing law enforcement capacity at the border.
Is there a worry, though, about sort of this increased militarization given
I didn't
the high
call
number
it that.
of
Those are your words, not mine. We worked with them to increase law enforcement at the border to deter the travel, which is a treacherous journey where many lose their lives. I think we have to gather. Thank you so much. Okay.
Expect anything on Afghanistan this week?
I don't have anything to preview for you on the timeline. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
time the paramedics rushed in to get him and to get him onto the stretcher into the back of the ambulance, at that point, a lot of time had passed. I give tremendous credit to the efforts of the paramedics and the doctors and nurses in the emergency room. I mean, they worked on him for what seemed...
Sustained. This is non-responsive.
Dr. Rich, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd would have lived if not for the 9 minutes and 29 seconds of subdual and restraint?
Objection.
Overruled if you have an opinion.
Let me finish my question for you, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether George Floyd would have lived if not for Mr. Chauvin's subdual and restraint of him for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on the ground?
Yeah.
Overruled. A reasonable degree of medical certainty.
Yes, I believe he would have lived.
Last question, Dr. Rich. Do you have an opinion as to whether a completely healthy George Floyd, that is, any healthy human being, would have survived the subdual and restraint that Mr. Floyd suffered during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of 2020?
Objection calls for speculation.
It's sustained is irrelevant as to a general person.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Sustained.
My question for you, Dr. Rich, is would any person, a healthy person, have survived the circumstances or conditions that George Floyd underwent during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds on May 25th of last year?
Same objection.
Sustained.
No further questions, Dr. Rich.
Thank you.
Members of the jury, let's take our 20-minute mid-morning recess. Let's come back at 11:25. Thank you.
Discharged their weapon and they struck the driver of the vehicle. And following that, the vehicle traveled several blocks before striking another vehicle. The Brooklyn Center police officers who were present at the scene and who were attempting to apprehend the driver did respond with an attempt at saving the young man's life. However, the young man died at the scene. Brooklyn Center officers do wear body cams, and so there is body camera footage of the event. And we do plan on releasing the body camera footage today. In fact, we plan to do so here. But, you know, I want to say that our hearts are aching right now. We are in pain right now. And we recognize that this couldn't have happened at a worse time. We recognize that this is happening at a time when our community, when all of America, indeed all of the world, is watching our community, that we are all collectively devastated, and we have been for over a year now by the killing of George Floyd, and that we continue to be distressed as we go through the Derek Chauvin trial. So having a police-involved shooting happen in our community and killing a young man is heartbreaking and just unfathomable. And so our entire community is filled with grief at yesterday's police-involved shooting that led to the killing of Dante Wright, a 20-year-old young African-American male. And my hearts go out to Dante's family and to all those who are impacted by this tragedy in our community and the world over. And while we await additional information from the BCA, which is leading this investigation, we continue to support members of our community as they gather peacefully amid our calls for transparency and accountability. Let me be clear. We will get to the bottom of this. We will do all that is within our power to make sure that justice is done for Dante Wright. We're going to continue to meet with community leaders and to hear their voices. In fact, we did that this morning. The chief and city council members and other elected officials from the state and city staff, city manager. We had a meeting earlier with community to be able to hear their voices in this time. And we're also going to have continue to conduct press conferences and share information with the public. As I stated, we do plan to show the body camera footage. And we're going to conduct a community press conference following this as well, so that we can talk directly with leaders of our community and organizations and share this information with them as well. We're going to also be providing some crisis counseling and mental health resources to all of our community members who may need and desire such services. And our collective community is grieving. Every single life, every member of our community is important to us. And so the events, like yesterday, are tragic. And, they take each and every one of us, they take a part of us as we experience these traumatic events. Just being exposed to it, I'm sure you're all feeling the aftermath of the weightiness of what we're all feeling collectively. And so I am going to invite Chief Tim Gannon to come up, and he's going to provide you a briefing about the details of what transpired yesterday, and then we'll stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Gannon. It's Gannon. I'm the Chief of Police here in Brooklyn Center. I've been the chief for approximately 5 years, and I've been a police officer in the city for 27. Today, I will be releasing the body-worn footage worn by the officer involved in the fatal officer-involved shooting that happened on Sunday afternoon. I've watched the video myself, and there's nothing I can say to lessen the pain of Mr. Wright's family, friends, loved ones, for that feeling of loss that they must have. That pain is shared by the community and also all those involved in the incident. What I can do is convey my deepest sympathies to the Wright family and be transparent with the information I'm aware of at this time. That will include showing a video portion from the point of deadly force used by the officer, as well as the officer's immediate reaction after the use of deadly force. I caution everybody as you watch this that this will be graphic and unedited. Could I have that video start, please?
Someone turn the lights off? Just a moment here. Okay. Will it be on both?
Go ahead. It should be on both screens.
Oh, wow.
Can you turn the lights back on, please?
We're trying to determine whether or not to terminate this officer?
As you can hear, the officer, while struggling with Mr. Wright, shouts, "Taser, taser," several times. That is part of the officer's training prior to deploying a taser, which is a less lethal device. That is done to make her partners aware, as well as the subject, that a taser deployment will be imminent. During this encounter, however, the officer drew their handgun instead of their taser. For informational purposes, we train with our handguns on our dominant side and our taser on our weak side. So if you're right-handed, you carry your firearm on your right side and you carry your taser on the left. This is done purposefully and is trained. As I watch the video and listen to the officer's commands, it is my belief that the officer had the intention to deploy their taser, but instead shot Mr. Wright with a single bullet. This appears to me, from what I've viewed and the officer's reaction in distress immediately after, that this was an accidental discharge that resulted in the tragic death of Mr. Wright. I have asked the BCA to conduct an independent investigation into the shooting and death. Once they are completed, I expect they will submit their findings, independent of me, to the appropriate authorities, the appropriate attorneys that will look and review this case. I'm also stressing that I do hope for the community to be patient and allow this investigation, criminal investigation, to be completed as thoroughly as possible. I believe Mr. Wright deserves this, as do all involved. The officer is currently on administrative leave. Make a short comment about what happened last night to our community, a community that I've been a part of for 27 years. I've seen some of the worst damage to this city I've ever seen in those years. Again, peaceful protesting, expressing yourself, we fully support that. But the ravaging of our businesses, the looting of our stores, the destruction to our pharmacies, we cannot tolerate that. I'm hoping that the community will have this level of transparency and know that this is being investigated by the correct authorities, which is the BCA. Unfortunately, they're not here today, but they are handling the investigation. And I have very little information besides what I've just given to you because they are handling that investigation. Mr. Mayor, do you have any comments you want to make?
All right, So we're going to open it up for questions, but I just want to reiterate that, obviously this is deeply tragic, and we're going to do everything that we can to ensure justice is done, to ensure that our communities are made whole. And with respect to the events last night, obviously there were folks in their community who were grieving, who showed up initially at the location where Dante Rice was killed, and were gathering, and obviously later on, as the night went on and unfolded, there were a series of events that led to an escalation in the protest later on into the evening. Later on, I did issue a curfew, which was in place until 6 a.m. this morning, to ensure that we're taking steps to keep the community safe. We do want to emphasize that we believe strongly in people's rights to gather and to express their grievance and to protest. That is a fundamental American right, and we're going to protect that right. And at the same time, we're going to also work to protect the safety of our community. And so we'll now open it up for questions.
Is it going to be sent over to the Hennepin County Attorney's Office for possible charges?
Chief?
It's far too early to know which authority is going to be prosecuting, if it's their prosecution. So I don't know how that's going to play out. Unfortunately, the BCA normally is present here during these types of conferences. But what I've understood is the releasing of video this early in a situation is not something that they condone. They leave it up to me to do that. And as I decided to do that, they're not part of this conversation. They're not part of this press conference at this time.
Why did you decide to do this today?
I felt the community needed to know what happened. They needed to see it. I needed to be transparent. And I want to be forthright. I due respect to Dante as well.
Chief, can you talk about what led to the traffic stop? Dante Wright's mother told reporters he had an air freshener hanging on his rear view mirror.
From what I've understood from the public safety briefing, there was an expired registration on the vehicle. That means the tabs were expired. Upon arrival, when the officer made contact, I think at that time when he walked up to the car, he discovered that there was a hanging item from the rearview mirror. So there was a contact that the officer went up there initially for, obtained his ID or his name, and he walked back to his car, and at that time he ran his name and he found out that he had a warrant. That's why they were moving from the car and they were making a custodial arrest.
Can you tell us more about the warrants?
I have very little information on the warrant other than it was a gross misdemeanor warrant.
Dante's brother tells us his brother didn't know he had a warrant for his arrest and recently missed meeting with his probation officer.
That I don't know.
So there is a perception, I think in the US and around the world, that had Dante Wright been my color, this wouldn't have happened to him. Why is it the police officers in the United States keep killing young black men and young black women far, far, far higher rate than they do white people?
I don't have an answer to that question.
Who fear this black man is real here in the state of Minnesota? I can answer that question.
Was there a gun found in the car?
There's no gun that I was made aware of. I did not search the car, but I've not been made aware of a gun in the vehicle.
The officer, is she under any type of
There has been
mental evaluation?
There has been a fair amount of social chatter in media, which I don't normally comment on, but there was some comments in social media that she had committed suicide. That is not true. That is not true. To the best of my knowledge, she's being taken care of right now.
What can you tell us about this officer and how long she's been with the department?
At this point in time, I don't have that. I will not release that information. That should be released very shortly, though. I believe the BCA has a system in place where they'll be releasing the names of all parties involved and also all their training records and all that information as far as tenure and seniority. That'll be released shortly.
Chief Andrea Broadus again, do you plan to step down if people call for your resignation after the actions
At this point, I do not.
Chief, what was happening then? What are we seeing in the video prior to the shot? You described the taser and the weapon. What was happening there?
I'm not in the mind of the officer. I can only see what you're all seeing. I can couple that with some of the training much of the training that I've received, and that's why I'm believing it to be an accidental discharge.
But prior to that, there was some sort of activity going on. When they were trying to take him into custody?
It appeared to me from the video that the individual was trying to get back into his car to leave.
Chief, how often do officers go through firearm training to try and maybe prevent something like that happening where you don't make that kind of mistake? Is it annual training, or is it, how does that work?
We have numerous trainings throughout the year. We don't try to lump it all in one group, so there's numerous trainings where we do tactical training, we do firearms training, we do taser deployments. We have pretty thorough taser requalifications on a yearly basis, but then we also do a number of scenarios and role-playing exercises as well. I can take one more question, please.
In the midst of a pandemic, why was it a priority to pull someone over for expired tax?
And I don't know if that was a priority, but it was a violation that the officer observed and initiated a traffic stop.
Chief, are you aware that there's a significant delay? Are you aware that there's a significant delay in getting tabs and things of this nature from the DMV? So even people who have purchased tabs are unable to get them because there's a 2 to 3 month backlog. Are you aware of that? And is your staff also aware of that? And have you made any type of recommendations to your staff to be mindful that we're in the middle of a pandemic and don't pull people over for tabs, particularly because there is a significant delay in getting those tabs from the Department of Motor Vehicles? Are you aware of that?
I am aware of
Chief
that.
of Police.
I am aware of that.
Is your staff aware of that?
Yes, they are.
Chief.
That was the last question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Mayor, may I ask you, in that video, the female officer clearly made a fatal mistake. She did the wrong thing. We understand she's going to be receiving some type of counseling, but should she lose her job since it's abundantly clear that she killed someone?
Let me be very clear. My position is that we cannot afford to make mistakes that lead to the loss of life of other people in our profession. And so I do fully support releasing the officer of her duties.
Do you support her being fired?
I do.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, you just said yourself, the whole world is watching the Twin Cities right now. Why weren't police forces looking out for, just looking out about what they were doing? Why weren't they taking greater precautions when they got involved in incidents like this? Do you have any answer for that?
I don't have an answer. I have not spoken with the officers involved myself. At this point, the BCA is the one that's in contact with those officers, and in fact is the only one that's allowed to be in contact with those officers.
Mr. Mayor, clearly, because you answered the question directly, you've given some thought to this idea of releasing this officer. With that said, what is the process? Can she be released immediately? Does she have to go through some type of appeals process? How does that work?
Well, under our form of government, the city manager who's here, you can come up, Kurt. He ultimately actually has control over the police department, not the mayor, and over the chief. So you can comment on that. The city council also, has ultimate authority over what happens in the city collectively. So the city council can take action in this regard as well. Go ahead, Mr. Bogany.
Thank you, Mr. Stand, spell your first and last name.
Yeah, my name is Kurt Bogany, Boganey. And in response to the question about termination, all employees working for the City of Brooklyn Center are entitled to due process with respect to discipline. This employee will receive due process, and that's really all that I can say today.
Do you support the termination of an officer like this who has made the type of mistake that has cost a resident of yours life? Do you support the termination of this type of officer? And what message are we sending here in Brooklyn Center to the rest of the world about the valuation of black life? Do you support the termination of this type of an officer?
You know, I understand and appreciate the comment that you made and why you said it. But if I were to answer that question, I would be contradicting what I said a moment ago, which is to say that all employees are entitled to due process, and after that due process, discipline will be determined. If I were to say anything else, I would actually be contradicting the idea of due process.
One final question.
Mm-hmm.
What's your expectation for how a significantly white police force here in Brooklyn Center treats the black and brown members of this community? What expectation have you communicated down to the chief and to the officers under him for how they are to interface with the vast majority, because the vast majority of this population is black and brown? How have you communicated to them to interface and interact with people who look like me?
Absolutely, I've communicated that to the chief, and I do believe that the chief concurs with the notion that every resident of Brooklyn Center must be treated fairly, must be treated equitably. The City Council has been very clear in its expectations about fairness and equity. We are implementing this year an Office of Anti-Racism Principles and Practices. We are hiring an equity officer in the next several weeks. The City Council has provided specific direction about accountability for the police department and transparency for the police department. We've been providing reports to the City Council. Yes, we're providing reports to the City Council about officer discipline, about information on stops of black and brown people or people of color in the city of Brooklyn Center. We're developing some task forces to assess if any of our policies or if any of our practices lead to disproportionate inequitable results. And our objective for doing that analysis is to eliminate any inequity that occurs as a result of our practices and our policies. And that has been communicated to the chief and to the police officers of the city of Brooklyn Center.
Is there clearly racial profiling that happened in this situation? We are standing in solidarity and calling for the firing of this officer. You have talked about her having due process, although Dante Wright did not get due process in that situation. She needs to be fired immediately to send a message that this type of behavior will not be condoned within the city of Brooklyn Center.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments.
Should an officer who can't tell the difference between a taser and a handgun, should they go out in a vehicle with both items in their car?
It really wouldn't be appropriate for me to respond to that.
Why would it not be appropriate, sir?
Because I can't make that judgment.
So as a supervisor of the police force, were you part of the decision last night to use tear gas on our youth who were protesting yesterday? And rubber bullets?
I was not.
Mr. City Manager, Mr. Mayor, when I asked that question about the firing of the police officer, the police chief left. Yeah. What is that an indication of? Is he dealing with something perhaps more important, or is that some type of silent protest? Because he left immediately.
I can't speculate.
Mr. Mayor, you have a comment?
I do not know why the excuse me.
Does that bother you without knowing why that he just walked out?
I do not know why the chief left. I can only speculate as to why he left at the time that he did.
Does it bother you?
What would your speculation be?
I don't have any speculation. I mean, it's possible that the chief takes a position perhaps similar to the city manager, that there needs to be some kind of a process, or I don't know. I mean, I would only.
What was the conversation between you and the chief? What was that conversation between you and the chief when you shared with the chief that you'd like to see this officer terminated? He didn't tell us anything about the officer, how long she's been on the force, her name, where she trained. These are questions the public deserves to know.
Certainly. Those conversations, I'm not, are privileged conversations, so I can't reveal that right now, but we should be able to provide the details around the officer and her trainings and those types of details. If you'll just give me a second, I'm just going to check to see if, is the chief engaged currently at the moment in addressing some public safety concerns or some other matter? Is there any reason why we can't have him answer some more questions around, folks are asking about the officers' training and whatnot?
How long she's been on the force?
Okay. Okay, so we're
If the chief can just walk out in the midst of a crisis,
so
the city is facing, he needs to be fired too.
just to be clear, we are checking right now with the chief to see if he will come back and stand for more questions.
What is the
and so
protocol for when there is protesters in the city Brooklyn Center and also outside of the police, the police office? And what is the normal protocol? What is the process for who decides and how does that decision happen? And then were those protocols and that process followed last night?
all right. So I will have the city manager and the chief speak on that, but I'll speak first. My role becomes active the moment that I declare a state of emergency, and if the city council acts to give the mayor authority over the police, or under their circumstances if there's a declaration of martial law. And so my role really is one of influence in those situations. I cannot give commands to the department. I cannot instruct the police chief to take certain actions or not to take certain actions. The person who can do that is the city manager. And so in terms of what the protocols are and for handling protests, I imagine the chief will be coming back to join us and speak on that shortly. But Mr. Bogany, if you have any comments on that.
And could you release the name of the officer who's involved in the shooting?
It's public data.
It's my understanding that name will be released very shortly, but it's my understanding that at this point the BCA, who's doing the investigation, is not. The
BCA is not required by law to conduct the investigation. You all specifically chose them, which means you have ultimate authority over what happens and what information is released. So just as the chief released that body camera footage, we're expecting the name of the officer to be released because that is public data. The BCA has no control over that whatsoever.
Well, let me say this, and I will let the chief address that particular question as well. But I will tell you this. We have every intent to release that information as quickly as possible, and I'll just leave it at that. We don't have, there's no reason or desire to withhold that information any longer than it's absolutely necessary.
So can you instruct the chief to release her name?
I won't do that at this moment, at this place.
Why?
It would be inappropriate.
That's not inappropriate. What was inappropriate was killing Dante Wright under those circumstances. So you are working harder to protect a killer cop than a victim of police murder.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm back. I'm sorry. I left. I'm used to doing the handoff with the BCA, and I apologize for that. Normally, the BCA steps in and they do a lot of the talk about the investigations. That's what I'm used to. So I apologize for that, but I'm back here now. I can answer some more questions, but please realize, in an officer-involved shooting, what happens is I have no contact with that investigation because I don't want to taint that investigation. People can say they scoff at that. I looked at this video, which is unprecedented. I don't know if any chiefs have done that very often or has looked at that video in advance of that. Sometimes you can't unwatch a video. So hold on, let me finish, please. So what I'm saying is I have limited information. I'm not trying to be disingenuous, but I'm trying to stay away from the investigation. I wish the BCA was here, but again, they probably tell you the same thing, that there's not much they can do because it's an early investigation. Now, please, one question at a time. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
May I ask you directly, as I asked the mayor, do you believe the officer who fired this fatal shot, and I understand there's due process, we get that, but ultimately she shot and killed a 20-year-old man. The mayor has indicated she should be terminated. What's your position on that?
My position is that officer afforded due process just like anybody else does. She has the right to be heard. She has the right to give her statement. She has the right to tell what she felt, what she thought. Not what I thought, not what I saw, but what she thought and and that may have an impact. She's on administrative time out. She will not be returning to duty until this investigation has run its course. And she, for all intents and purposes, I think we can look at the video and ascertain whether or not she'll be returning.
So the fact that this is not the first time this has happened.
So one question at a time, please. It was over here?
Yes.
Yes,
The
ma'am.
fact that this is not the first time that this has happened in the city of Brooklyn Center. 2 years ago, we had another officer involved shooting where a young man lost his life. You understand that the public do not trust you and your department right now. And what we are asking for, you are not giving to us. You should already have a process by now on how to deal with the situation. And we really demand to know the information of the officer involved in the shooting.
Okay. The first question is we do have a process in place, and that's leaning on the BCA to do their investigation. Every shooting that I've seen, every shooting that I've witnessed has been different. Every circumstance is different around every shooting. It's tragic every time. The loss of life is obviously tragic, but there are different circumstances around every situation. In this particular situation, it was very important for me to get that video out as quickly as possible, and that's what I did.
Chief, absolutely unprecedented. I lived in Minnesota 7 years, worked here. Can you just tell us a little bit about how long the officer was on the force here in Brooklyn Center? Was she around when Barway was pulled from the body of water 6 years ago today?
The information on the officer is she's a very senior officer. That's the extent that I can do. A very senior officer, and like I do believe that the BCA will be releasing all the information, training records, everything that they have. They'll be releasing that. That's public data. That'll be coming out shortly.
And Chief, what is the normal protocol and process for response to protesters? And was that protocol and process followed last night?
There was strict adherence to the policy of working with a protest when it turns into a riot. Last night there were numerous warnings to disperse because it was an unlawful assembly. It was declared at least 5 times while I was there. Plenty of time was given to disperse, and it was not.
Was it your decision to release tear gas and to shoot rubber bullets at the young protesters?
Sure. I'm the police chief in this city. Police action is made by me. The decision is made by me. Does that answer your question?
So I have a question. Upon myself and other organizers and activists coming up to the police station, we were really shocked to see utter darkness, to see all of the lights, both interior and exterior, extending all the way out, making the street virtually dark. We were really shocked and surprised to see that. From my experience, and I would imagine most other people's experiences, law enforcement would want to have as much light as possible to be able to see whatever is going on. I was told that the moment the lights all went down, that created a certain level of mood, a certain agitation within the crowd. What was your thinking? Because I was told that you made the ultimate call to turn all the lights off, even the street lights that was out in front of the building, to turn all of the lights off. What was your thinking about turning off the lights in the midst of people coming and
Sure.
attempting to redress
Sure.
At the police station? What was your decision behind turning off all the lights?
I don't know about the lights on the street, but I know the building lights were turned off because they created a backlighting for the officers that were on the front lines. They became targets for concrete blocks, frozen cans that I personally saw in duct. So that's what I turned those lights off. So that
turning off the lights made them less of targets? Or?
Yes, they weren't backlit. So then the people that were in front, they couldn't see it. So if we have lights in front of us, that's what the police department would like to have. We'd like to be looking out forward, not behind us, because then you get backlit.
So the lights that I'm talking about were all around, so the lights were all around the front part of the building. The police were well behind that, but it just created an entire darkness around. It seemed very unusual for a station to have all the lights off, including the lights all in the streets, to create utter darkness and a lot of confusion and a real ominous kind of mood. And I would say that it's very unusual. I've been to a lot of police stations. I've been to a lot of protests. I've been to a lot of these type of events. I have never seen the police department utterly shut down all of the lights. What was your thinking behind, not the backlit lights, but all of the lights, even in the front part of the police station in general, to create utter darkness?
Sir,
and then also,
sure.
one final question. What was your decision to issue a dispersal order while they were peacefully protesting in front of the police station? what led to you to issue a dispersal order, and then on the back end of that 10-minute dispersal order, then to issue out CO2 canisters and gas for the crowd?
So,
Can you talk to us about
yeah,
that?
just so everybody's clear, I was front and center at the protest, at the riot. We did not.
It was a protest. Don't do that.
There was no
Okay.
riot at this
There
time.
was. So the officers that were putting themselves in harm's way were being pelted with frozen cans of pop. They were being pelted with concrete blocks. And yes, we had our helmets on and we had other protection gear, but an officer was injured, hit in the head with a brick. That was a Hennepin County deputy. He was transported to the hospital. So we had to make decisions. We had to disperse the crowd because we can't allow our officers to be harmed. And I've already answered the question, I believe, about your lighting. I know that's a big deal with you, and I understand that, but I thought I've explained that myself. So that is, I told you it's my decision, and that's why I made that decision. Is there another question? Yes, ma'am.
I mean, the room's tense, I can feel it.
Yes, ma'am.
What is on your heart? He's defensive. Let him answer, guys.
Sure.
Like, speak to us for real. Like, keep it 100.
This is what I'm here for. Okay? I'm the leader of this department. They expect me to lead, create a safe city. That's what I'm trying to do. So that's it.
I hope you're not crying too.
Okay? And yeah, I'm emotional.
Guys, he's being honest.
I'm just trying to be honest. So.
When I have a question for you.
Yes, sir.
When you asked the protesters to take a step back across the street, what was the reasoning for, after they went across the street, you shot tear gas grenades and flashbangs where the people were across the street where you had originally told them to be?
Sure. The only time that we return, in every situation that we had, we returned fire. So when we got pelted with bricks or frozen cans, which we've collected, we photographed the evidence. We have the evidence. We can show that to you in the future. But once we got pelted, then we responded in kind. And there was a distance there was a distance and everything that.
Who had nothing to do with throwing anything. That's
Sure.
the danger of turning off the lights
Sure.
and firing tear gas and firing rubber bullets and firing flashbang grenades at people who were just exercising their First Amendment rights
Sure.
to freedom of speech. That's the problem, Chief.
I understand that,
Did you
ma'am.
do things differently
Would I do things differently last night?
than last night?
Absolutely
When
not.
the protest happened?
Absolutely not. We had a situation where we were bringing in an arrest team, and we were worried. How many people are we going to arrest? When we started to move the people, finally, hours into the situation, you know how many people we arrested that stayed? 2 people. If we hadn't done that, if we hadn't moved people along, I don't know what would have happened, and I don't know where they would have reformed. But the people that left were allowed to leave. We didn't trap them. We didn't make mass arrests. We arrested 2 people.
So what are the plans for tonight?
Tonight we're going. If it's a peaceful protest, if it's a First Amendment protest, go to it.
I guess what's your
We'll
definition
allow.
of a peaceful protest? Because we don't understand.
Yeah, not being pelted with bricks, blocks, and being targeted.
What we saw yesterday were young people up with their hands up.
Yeah.
And they were being tear gassed. And
Yeah.
you were talking about your officers being hurt. We can count how many people got hurt yesterday too.
Okay.
So that's what I'm going to ask again. Are you planning on doing things differently tonight?
We are going to have our officers lined up to protect this building, to protect the city as best we can. That's what we're going to do today, and that's what we do every day.
I got one more question. When the officers were firing tear gas and flashbangs, there was an apartment complex with families behind it, and that's where a lot of the flashbangs were going. Had a flashbang, went into one of those windows and started that building on fire, it put a lot of other people at risk.
Okay.
Why?
I didn't see any flashbang that was very close to those apartments. 1400, 67th, I was there. I didn't see anybody.
6700
Yeah.
Humboldt.
40, 6740.
Right overhead, over the building.
Okay.
And we saw that last night.
And I didn't see that myself. So good. And I'm not discounting you.
Why was
Are there going to be more questions?
Why was Dante Wright's body left in the streets for hours yesterday?
The due respect for Dante was given at my order to keep the respect of his body, whether that be covered it or fenced it around. but we needed to have it maintained because we needed the investigation to be complete and thorough. The documentation is not done by us. It's done by the BCA crime team, which is the entity that investigates these situations. They came out as quickly as they could. They processed the scene as quickly as they could. We did not want to maintain, as people have mentioned, once the officers left, the protests and the disturbance went away. We were trying to get our officers out there as soon as possible.
Do you understand how dehumanizing that was to have a body lay in the street for 5 hours?
That was a priority of my assignment, to get him removed from that as soon as possible without disturbing the crime scene, so that we wouldn't be accused of tampering with the evidence.
All right, now let me ask, Chief, you can stay here for a second. Are there any other questions here from any of the media folks? No?
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Okay. Any, is
Yes,
that
I have a question.
final question? All right.
Final question. So, Police Chief, we hear that you have committed to protecting this building and protecting the city tonight if there are protests. Will you commit to protecting protesters and the people of the city?
I am committed to protecting the peaceful protesters of the city every day.
Not yesterday.
Not yesterday.
Peaceful protesters.
I
They
was
were
a peaceful
peaceful.
protester,
Yeah.
and they were targeting me.
Okay.
All right. So thank you, everybody. Just to reiterate, you know, my commitment, our commitment as a city, and in many ways we need to recommit to that. That is to making sure that we are protecting peaceful protesters. We're protecting the rights of people to gather and grieve, and give their grievances to the government. And so we're going to work to continue to protect those rights, protect peaceful protesters, and to make sure that we're also securing the safety of our community. Thank you.
Understand that when peaceful protesters gather and they are met with violence, that things are going to escalate, and at that point you can't blame them and call them rioters?
Yeah.
You understand that?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
So we have a community press conference down
about how to move forward this package in a bipartisan manner.
So is he willing to negotiate on the scope and the price tag, or just on ways to pay for this?
He absolutely is. He looks forward to hearing their ideas, and his objective is to find a way forward where we can modernize our nation's infrastructure so we can compete with China. He's proposed a way to pay for it, which is what he thinks the responsible thing is to do, and he hopes they'll come to the table with ideas. Go ahead, Josh.
I get asked for an update. On March 18th, you said that there was a stockpile of 7 million AstraZeneca doses, some of which were loaned to the Canadians and Mexicans. Can you give us a current number and say whether the president is considering sending more either to those countries or other countries?
I don't have anything to predict in terms of sharing the stockpile at this point. I can assure you that we don't want that stockpile to expire. And obviously we don't have control over the FDA approval process, but I don't have anything more to preview for you at this point.
The first May doses that are in that stockpile would expire?
I'm happy to check for you, Josh, and see if there's more we can share. And AstraZeneca themselves, of course, could share more details probably.
Does the White House know whether any U.S.-made shots have left U.S. soil other than those loans? In other words, shots made on U.S. soil but not for the U.S. government?
From the companies?
Yeah, correct. So can the companies export currently as long as they're meeting their U.S. obligation?
All right, everybody, we are going to get out of...
Floyd, Kobe Heisler, Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Sandra Bland, Donna Taylor, Dante Wright. None of these souls deserve to die at the hands of those sworn to protect and serve our communities.
Investing in that infrastructure and building out America's supply chain so we never again are at the mercy of another country or any other nation for their critical needs. That's what we mean by investing in infrastructure. And we're investing in a more resilient grid and water systems so Americans can have clean water infrastructure. We're investing in high-speed rail infrastructure. We're building charging stations to support America's electric vehicle future and investing in that infrastructure. And building out America's supply chain so we never again are at the mercy of another country or any other nation for their critical needs. That's what we mean by investing in infrastructure. And we're investing in a more resilient grid. I understand you discussed that a little bit earlier today. Investing as well in asbestos-free schools for our kids. That's investing in infrastructure. Building a support system to take care of our elderly parents and our kids with disabilities at home so that people can go to work. That's investing in infrastructure. Chips like the one I have here, these chips, these wafers, are batteries, broadband, it's all infrastructure. This is infrastructure. So look, we need to build the infrastructure of today, not repair the one of yesterday. And the plan I propose is going to create millions of jobs, rebuild America, protect our supply chains, and revitalize American manufacturing. And it's going to Americans can have clean water infrastructure. We're investing in high-speed rail infrastructure. We're building charging stations to support America's electric vehicle future and investing in that infrastructure. And building out America's supply chain so we never again are at the mercy of another country or any other nation for their critical needs. That's what we mean by investing in infrastructure. And we're investing in a more resilient grid. I understand you discussed that a little bit earlier today. Investing as well in asbestos-free schools for our kids. That's investing in infrastructure. Building a support system to take care of our elderly parents and our kids with disabilities at home so that people can go to work. That's investing in infrastructure. Chips like the one I have here, these chips, these wafers, our batteries, broadband, it's all infrastructure. This is infrastructure. So look, we need to build the infrastructure of today, not repair the one of yesterday. And the plan I propose is going to create millions of jobs, rebuild America, protect our supply chains, and revitalize American manufacturing. And it's going to make America research and development a great engine again. We led the world in the middle of the 20th century. We led the world toward the end of the century. We're going to lead the world again. We're going to lead it again in the 21st century. We have the best minds in the country. Many of them are on the screen right now. And they know better than anyone that our competitiveness depends on where you invest and how you invest. For too long as a nation, we haven't been making the big, bold investments we need to outpace our global competitors. We've been falling behind on research and development and manufacturing. And put it bluntly, we have to step up our game. And I'm not ready to give up. I'm ready to work with all of you, with the Congress, both parties, to pass the American Jobs Plan and to make a once-in-a-generation investment in America's future. Again, we'll provide the innovation and spur breakthroughs, and we need the support, all your support on the screen and others in order to get this work done. And we need you in turn to support the American workers, American communities in every part of the country. This is a moment for American strength and American unity, for government, industry, communities to work together to make sure that we're ready to meet the global competition that lies ahead, not continue to slide in terms of our investment. We rank like number 25th in the world now. That's not America. So I want to thank you all very much, and I appreciate all the time you've given us.
Mr. President, could you speak to the issue in Minnesota, please, sir?
Whoa. Hang on just a second.
Mr. President, would you like to speak to the issue in Minnesota?
Wait a second. What I'm going to do, I'm going to see you all again in a few minutes. I've just taken the time, reason I was a few minutes late, to listen to the press conference. I'm preparing a statement, and I'll be happy to talk with you at the next meeting, okay? Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Hanging from my mirror, and a black man in America. Listen! I have a wife and a career I love, and I'm able to speak today. 3 things Dante can never have. 3 things that could easily be snatched away from me because someone deemed me a threat, or I moved wrong, or my cell phone looked like a gun. Which is why we are here today on behalf of Dante and all the lives lost at the hands of the police, and to prevent further loss of lives at the hand of the police. The injustices that took place over the last 24 hours were not only heartbreaking, but also calculated and methodical, without remorse or any consideration for the pain which our community is collectively experiencing. What I saw last night was not policing. It wasn't positive, it wasn't de-escalating. It wasn't provoked. What I witnessed was agitation, intimidation, irritation, and escalation.
Listen!
The police chief and his subordinates last night instigated the escalation as they launched an assault on a peaceful protest. The actions, although not unheard of or even surprising, were appalling and need to be addressed. Those in power and those who commit acts of violence while wearing a badge must be held accountable.
Yes.
Change has to happen. Change in who is policing us and change in how. We not only ask that you see us, we not only ask that you hear us, we not only ask that you stand with us instead of against us, but we demand that you see us and we demand that you hear us. We demand that you feel the pain which you have inflicted upon an entire people and community. We demand that you stop killing us. We demand justice. We demand peace from the police. We demand accountability. We demand follow-through and transparent actions on all levels of the processes and events to follow. We demand the firing of the officer involved as well as the leader of the events that took place last night.
Yes.
We demand better because we deserve better. Thank you.
Yes. 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 Right.
JAYLANIHUSSEIN, the Executive Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations here in Minnesota. I want to echo what others have said. I do not know what to tell Dante Wright's family other than we have failed you. The city of Brooklyn Center has failed you. The state of Minnesota has failed you. And America has failed you. Time and time again, we are standing in the same position, talking about the same issue, that yet nothing has happened. Right now, while the entire world is watching the Chauvin trial, the Brooklyn Center Police Department, to show how deadly policing in America is toward people of color, killed an unarmed, young, 20-year-old, thriving young man. Dante Wright should be with us today. His mother should not be grieving, nor his family, nor last night what we saw, his community.
Yeah.
What has been happening in this country is a continuation of what's been happening before. And that is why we are demanding for systematic changes. Just because we are demanding justice inside the courthouse in George Floyd's case, there is no justice outside the courthouse. Nothing has fundamentally changed in the state of Minnesota to hold police officers accountable. When we heard the news, as we were grieving and remembering Justin Tigan on Sunday, community members rushed over here
expeditiously
and came out in support of this family and to learn. And again, the same practice occurred. The police sent out a press release and information lying about what happened last night. And today, as we all saw the evidence of how young Dante Wright was killed, we are told it's an accident. But I'm going to tell you, it is not an accident. Dante Wright was killed before he was even stopped, because he's a black man in America. Dante Wright was killed by this white...
Let's take another quick 2-minute break here on News Now from Fox.
Have been saying and echoing for the last nearly 10 years. But the reality is, last night as Dante was killed and community members showed up bravely on those streets demanding justice, that is what we are seeing and that is what we are hopeful about tomorrow. As today you saw an officer who herself in the video is clearly saying that she made a mistake, is still on the force as we speak right now. If it's any other profession, she would have been walked out of the job at that moment.
Expeditiously.
Yet, this police officer is protected not only by her own police chief, but the system. And not only that, that entire military that is outside right now in the state is protecting a killer police officer. And that is what we are demanding for. We are demanding that she is fired. We are also demanding that the police chief also go with her and be fired. We are also demanding the city manager to be fired. Last night, community leaders, myself and others, have reached out to the mayor and others, and we were standing here to de-escalate the situation. We asked for who was the leader, and they informed us it was the police chief. We said, can we talk to him to de-escalate the situation? We were told he is working on his plans, and we saw what those plans were last night. They turned off the lights.
Yes.
And they militarized this building, and they began to fire on children, women on those buildings.
Yes.
You could see the toys on the balcony of those children that were terrorized last night by the decisions of the police chief, by the decisions of the city manager to protect a killer cop. To protect a killer cop.
Yes.
To protect a killer cop. Not someone who made a mistake, but a killer cop. And so we are asking as a community, enough is enough. The escalation that we are seeing from the National Guard and all of this militarization is here to protect killer cops, not to protect people from the killer cops that are killing us. And I am telling people that the state of Minnesota is the most racist state in the union. And they are, because they are they are racist with a smile. The worst form of racism. And that is what we have been dealing with. If you are a black person in the state of Minnesota, you have been dealing with that. And right now, while many of us are trying to pass police accountability bills, Warren Limmer, the senator, Republican senator, refused to hear a single one. What does that tell you? That tells you that the system in this state of Minnesota believes in killer cops, stands behind killer cops, and will refuse to do anything about killer cops. But the day that the people are silent is no more. We will fill the streets. We will do everything in our power to bring back justice for Dante Wright, to bring justice for George Floyd, to bring justice for all the families that have been killed by state-sanctioned police violence. That we, our tax dollars, are killing ourselves right now. And so with the last thing I want to say to many of you media right now.
Listen!
You, for the longest time, have showed up to incidents where police officers have killed people. Come on. And you continue to project their narratives. You project their story, but you do not ask the questions that are hard. And many of you today have been left out in the cold, like the community has been left out in the cold, because these people are trying to hide the truth. We want the truth, we want accountability, and we want transparency. And we will demand for justice by any means necessary.
That part.
Oh, that was powerful. I don't even know how to go after you. My name is Alfreda Daniels, A-L-F.
Of Dante and all the lives lost at the hands of the police, and to prevent further loss of lives at the hand of the police. The injustices that took place over the last 24 hours were not only heartbreaking, but also calculated and methodical, without remorse or any consideration for the pain which our community is collectively experiencing. What I saw last night was not policing. It wasn't positive, it wasn't de-escalating. It wasn't provoked. What I witnessed was agitation, intimidation, irritation, and escalation. The police chief and his subordinates last night instigated the escalation as they launched an assault on a peaceful protest. The actions, although not unheard of or even surprising, were appalling and need to be addressed. Those in power and those who commit acts of violence while wearing a badge must be held accountable. Change has to happen. Change in who is policing us and change in how. We not only ask that you see us, we not only ask that you hear us, we not only ask that you stand with us instead of against us, but we demand that you see us and we demand that you hear us. We demand that you feel the pain which you have inflicted upon an entire people and community. We demand that you stop killing us. We demand justice. We demand peace from the police. We demand accountability. We demand follow-through and transparent actions on all levels of the processes and events to follow. We demand the firing of the officer involved as well as the leader of the events that took place last night.
Yeah.
We demand better because we deserve better. Thank you.
Yeah. 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 Right.
JAYLANIHUSSEIN, the Executive Director for the Council on American Islamic Relations here in Minnesota. I want to echo what others have said. I do not know what to tell Daunte Wright's family other than we have failed you. The city of Brooklyn Center have failed you. The state of Minnesota has failed you. And America has failed you. Time and time again, we are standing in the same position, talking about the same issue, that yet nothing has happened. Right now, while the entire world is watching the Chauvin trial, the Brooklyn Center Police Department, to show how deadly policing in America is toward people of color, killed an unarmed, young, 20-year-old, thriving young man. Daunte Wright should be with us today. His mother should not be grieving, nor his family, nor last night what we saw, his community.
Yeah.
What has been happening in this country is a continuation of what's been happening before. And that is why we are demanding for systematic changes. Just because we are demanding justice inside the courthouse in George Floyd's case, there is no justice outside the courthouse. Nothing has fundamentally changed in the state of Minnesota to hold police officers accountable. When we heard the news, as we were grieving and remembering Justin Tigan on Sunday, community members rushed over here
expeditiously
and came out in support of this family and to learn. And again, the same practice occurred. The police sent out a press release of information lying about what happened last night. And today, as we all saw the evidence of how young Daunte Wright was killed, we are told it's an accident. But I'm going to tell you, it is not an accident. Daunte Wright was killed before he was even stopped because he's a black man in America. Daunte Wright was killed by this white...
Let's take another quick 2-minute break here on News Now from Fox.
We have been saying and echoing for the last nearly 10 years. But the reality is, last night as Daunte was killed and community members showed up bravely on those streets demanding justice, that is what we are seeing and that is what we are hopeful about tomorrow. As today you saw an officer who herself in the video is clearly saying that she made a mistake, is still on the force as we speak right now. If it's any other profession, she would have been walked out of the job at that moment.
Expeditiously.
This police officer is protected not only by her own police chief, but the system. And not only that, that entire military that is outside right now in the state is protecting a killer police officer. And that is what we are demanding for. We are demanding that she is fired. We are also demanding that the police chief also go with her and be fired. We are also demanding the city manager to be fired. Last night, community leaders, myself and others, have reached out to the mayor and others, and we were standing here to de-escalate the situation. We asked for who was the leader, and they informed us it was the police chief. We said, can we talk to him to de-escalate the situation? We were told he is working on his plans, and we saw what those plans were last night. They turned off the lights, and they militarized this building, and they began to fire on children and women on those buildings. You could see the toys on the balcony of those children that were terrorized last night by the decisions of the police chief, by the decisions of the city manager to protect a killer cop. To protect a killer cop. to protect a killer cop. Not someone who made a mistake, but a killer cop. And so we are asking as a community, enough is enough. The escalation that we are seeing from the National Guard and all of this militarization is here to protect killer cops, not to protect people from the killer cops that are killing us. And I am telling people that the state of Minnesota is the most racist state in the union. And they are, because they are they are racist with a smile. The worst form of racism. And that is what we have been dealing with. If you are a black person in the state of Minnesota, you have been dealing with that. And right now, while many of us are trying to pass police accountability bills, Warren Limmer, senator, Republican senator, refused to hear a single one. What does that tell you? That tells you that the system in this state of Minnesota believes in killer cops, stands behind killer cops, and will refuse to do anything about killer cops. But the day that the people are silent is no more. We will fill the streets. We will do everything in our power to bring back justice for Dante Wright, to bring justice for George Floyd, to bring justice for all the families that have been killed by state-sanctioned police violence. That we, our tax dollars, are killing ourselves right now. And so with the last thing I want to say to many of you media right now. Listen! You, for the longest time, have showed up to incidents where police officers have killed people. Come on! And you continue to project their narratives. You project their story, but you do not ask the questions that are hard. And many of you today have been left out in the cold, like the community was been left out in the cold, because these people are trying to hide the truth. We want the truth, we want accountability, and we want transparency. And we will demand for justice by any means necessary. That part.
Oh, that was powerful. I don't even know how to go after you. My name is Alfreda Daniels, A-L-F-R-E-D-A. Last name is D-A-N-I-E-L-S. I am a community leader. I have organized in this area for over 12 years, and I'm a resident of Brooklyn Center. As you all can see, I'm an expectant mother. I own my home here. My husband and I live here in Brooklyn Center, and this is our home. And we choose this space for many, many reasons. One of them is not to get killed. I am also a wife of a black man who served this country, and he's currently out right now in Kuwait. And I worried about him every day, even when he's back, whether he's in his uniform or not. And this incident today and every other incident that have happened in this country, in this state, have actually made my fear become reality. Today we all were in the room and we listened to our police chief defend a police officer who killed or murdered a young black man yesterday. As we watched that video after she shot and killed Dante, they laughed about it. They didn't feel bad. She said, I shot a man and other officers were laughing about it. That's how much our lives means. That's how much my child's life is going to mean. That's how much my husband's life means to them. Not only are they killing us, they're incarcerating us, and then they're telling us that we are from single homes, we are from single family homes, we don't have fathers, because they are killing our fathers. What we demand today is the immediate termination of this officer. She has to be gone. She has no place in the police force right now. Not only her termination, I also agree and stand with other leaders who said that the police chief needs to be gone. Part of this reason is not just because of his response today.
All right, everyone, we are going to definitely be following all the developments coming out of Brooklyn Center today into the afternoon. And
whatever it takes to breathe. The police chief got to go. Our city manager have to go. He is not being accountable to the community. He has not been. This has not been the first. This is not the first incident in Brooklyn Center. 2 years ago, we watched a young man, Kobe, got killed by the same Brooklyn Center police officers. When we try to have conversations, they dismissed us like they've dismissed us today. They gotta go. The city manager needs to be held accountable for their actions last night. What happened last night could have easily led to another murder on the streets, and they would have defended it like they're defending it right now. They're concerned about the officers who got hurt. Those are the officers who actually escalated the situation. This is why we also asked for divergent funds to people who actually know how to deal with community. People were hurt yesterday, and they came here yesterday to actually express their hurt. And instead of actually being taken into consideration, they were met with violence. And they had every right to retaliate the way they did. We demand transparency. Come on. Everything that's happening right now, we're not seeing the true transparency of this police force. The city, our police chief likes to pat himself on the back and say, listen, look, I shared a video with you within 24 hours. He kept repeating that because he thought that was a good thing. He did us a favor. That was not a favor. We need full transparency as to what happened and what's going to happen to this officer. And we need it now, and we are going to demand that. Within giving us that transparency and information, we demand the truth. We all know across the country, across the state, how police officers have manipulated the evidence. Today we heard a lot in there about why he was pulled over, expired tabs, and then because of an air freshener he was suspected, and then they double checked to see if he had a warrant. When we all know we have checked and we didn't see any warrant. Was that warrant pulled out after he got killed? Or was there even a warrant in the first place? Right. They refused to answer our questions and they've left us in the cold. But I tell you this today, we will continue to take over the streets of Minnesota. Yeah. We will continue to take over the streets of this country until our lives matter. Thank you. Yeah.
But most importantly today, I'm a mother. And when I looked at the picture of Dante Wright, it reminded me of my own son.
All right, we will get back out to Minnesota.
Yeah, no, it looks like, the defense is going to begin their trial or their course of their case pretty soon. We may have one more witness for the state. So once the defense is done, we're going to have closing arguments and then it'll go to the jury. So it's going to be interesting to see how many witnesses Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, brings up to the stand.
And as we were listening to today,
Statement calls the next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Phalonis Floyd.
Hold on. If you could wait out in the hallway just for a second, Counsel Cyber. please. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
And sir, if you would feel comfortable doing so, if you could remove your mask, that'd be great. And we're going to test out the microphone. First, have you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Philonis O'Neal Floyd, Philonise, O'Neal, Oneil, Floyd, Floyd.
Mr. Swisher.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sir, you're here to testify about your brother, George Floyd, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And before you tell the jury about your brother, I'd like you to introduce yourself to the jury a little bit so they know something about you. How old are you?
39.
Was George your older or younger brother?
He was my oldest brother.
Okay. Are you married?
Yes, sir.
And do you have children?
Yes, sir.
How many children do you have?
2.
And sir, where do you, what state do you live in?
Houston, Texas.
I'd like you to tell the jury a little bit about your brother, George Floyd. First, can you tell the jury where and when he was born?
He was born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, but he left at a young age. We moved to Houston, Texas, and I have 2 other sisters that are older than us. It's Jaja Floyd, Latonya Floyd, then became George Floyd, and I'm next Philonis Floyd, and my other brother Rodney Floyd, who's my mom's baby boy.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
And was he born on October 14, 1973?
Yes, sir.
And you say that the family left Fayetteville shortly after he was born, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you all grew up in Houston together?
We all grew up in Houston.
Who were George's parents?
Lasinia Jones Floyd, and his father was George Perry Floyd Sr.
Right. And did Lasinia, is that your mother?
That's my mother, but they called her Miss Sissy.
Miss Sissy.
Yes, sir.
Who called her Miss Sissy?
Everybody called her Miss Sissy. We just called her Mom, but everybody around the neighborhood called her Miss Sissy. Anybody that knew her called her that, and that was that. They had to be like 50 years of age, but everybody younger than that called her Mom. That was George's age. Everybody called her Mom because she was a mom to so many people in the community.
What community was that?
That was in 3rd Ward, and I grew up in the CUNY Home Housing Authority projects. It was low income poverty. So we stayed with each other all the time. Me and George, we grew up together playing video games a lot. His favorite game was on Nintendo. We played Double Dribble and we played Tecmo Bowl. And I finally beat him in a game, and I was just so happy just thinking about that. And he reset the game and would say, "Come on, let's play again." And I'd be like, "No, I gotta go do our chores now. Let me do my chores." But George also, he used to make the best banana mayonnaise sandwiches, and he used to make syrup sandwiches because George couldn't cook, he couldn't boil water. So, and also if you all were there in our house, you'll see George had lines on the wall because he will always measure with his height, trying to see how tall he is, because he wanted to be taller all the time because he loved sports. So he always wanted to be the best. And
I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. I appreciate you sharing that with us. I'd like to show the witness what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 284. Do you recognize the picture in 284?
Yes, sir.
Is that a picture of your mother and George when he was younger?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to offer Exhibit 284.
Any objection? 284 is received.
Permission to publish. Sir, would you please describe this photo and what you know about it?
That's my mother. She's no longer with us right now, but that's my oldest brother, George. Yeah. I miss both of them. I was married. In May 24th, I got married. And my brother was killed May 25th. And my mom died on May 30th. So it's like a bittersweet month because I'm supposed to be happy when that month comes.
Sir, I'm going to ask you some questions about your mom's passing a little bit. If you need a moment, I can take a minute. And just let me know when you're ready. Okay. Going back to growing up in the CUNY homes, can you please tell the jury what role George Floyd had as the older brother in that household?
He was so much of a leader to us in the household. He would always make sure that we had our clothes for school. He made sure that we all were going to be to school on time. And like I told you, George couldn't cook, but he'll make sure you have a snack or something to get in the morning. But he was one of those people in the community that when they had church outside, people would attend church just because he was there. Nobody would go out there until they seen him. And he just was like a person that everybody loved around the community. He just knew how to make people feel better.
And sir, you indicated, well, first you aware of where George Floyd went to school?
Mm-hmm. He went to school at Blackshear Elementary, and from Blackshear it was Ryan Middle School, and from Ryan it was Jack Gates High School, where he excelled in sports and basketball and football. He had received a scholarship to attend South Florida College, and from there he played basketball there, and he transferred to Texas A&M Kingsville, where he played football.
All right. Now, I'd like to show the witness Exhibit 285 for identification. Sir, do you recognize what's shown in Exhibit 285?
Yes, sir.
Is that a picture of your brother when he was at the Jack Yates High School in Houston?
Yes, sir.
Offer Exhibit 285.
Any objection? 285 is received.
And permission to publish. Approximately how old would George Floyd have been when this picture was taken?
It looked like 18 or 17 at that time.
And you talked about basketball and playing basketball. If I can show Exhibit 287 to the witness. 287. Thank you. All right, showing you what's been marked for identification is Exhibit 287. Do you recognize this photo?
Yes, sir.
Is there a picture of your brother in this photo?
Yeah, he's number 5, South Florida, all the way in the left-hand corner.
All right, I'm going to offer Exhibit 287.
Any objection? 287 is received.
And permission to publish. All right, you indicated that your brother was number 5. Is that on the far left?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And South Florida, was that a community college?
South Florida was a community college. I'm looking at it. I noticed a whole bunch of the ball players because I met a lot of them coming up.
Did George Floyd maintain his level of fitness and love of basketball throughout his life?
Yes, sir. He loved to work out. He loved playing basketball. He loved teaching people the game of basketball. That's, to me, where I really learned how to play from him, because he guided a lot of guys on the court and showed them what they need to do to be better.
And when he would talk about playing basketball, would he use any particular term or phrase?
Oh, he said, "Hey, man, let's go hooping," and we will always say, "Come on, let's go." We always went hooping, and you have to hoop every day, because if you don't, go and shoot a whole bunch of shots, like 50 to 100 shots a day. My brother will always say, you'll never be able to compete. Hooping was big because Magic, you had to watch the stars. We watched Michael, we watched Magic, we watched everybody hoop every day.
And if you could take that down, you indicated that George Floyd was also interested in football, or had a passion for football. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Would he play catch with you?
He would play catch with us. It's funny how I always thought that my brother couldn't throw, but he never intended to throw the ball to me. He will always throw it at an angle where I have to go chase it and jump for it or dive for it. And I came up to him one day, I said, man, I see why you play tight end and stuff, because you can't throw it all. And he was like, I don't want to throw the ball to you, because if I throw it to you, you'll never understand. You have to go get the ball. He said, the ball should never come to you. You should always tell yourself, I'm going to go get the football, because you have to attack the ball. That's what he told me.
And, sir, was your brother a father?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to show you what's been marked for identification as Exhibit 290, just to the witness. Do you recognize what's shown in Exhibit 290?
Yes, sir.
Is that a picture of your brother with his daughter?
Yes, sir.
Offer Exhibit 290.
Any objection? 290 is received.
And permission to publish. And what's his daughter's name?
Gianna.
And how old is she now?
7.
Sir, could you please, for the jury, describe George Floyd's relationship with his mother?
Oh, it was one of a kind. George, he would always be up on our mom. He was a big mama's boy. I cry a lot, but George, he loved his mom. He will always just be up on her. And you know, every mother loves all of her kids, but it was so unique how they were with each other. He would just lay up on her in the fetus position like he was still in a womb. I would see him every day, and I'd say, period. I'd say period because we called him Perry instead of George. And he would always say, hold on, let me kiss mama before I come over there. And being around him, he showed us like how to treat our mom and how to respect our mom. He loved her so dearly. And when George, he had found out that my mom was passing because she had to stay with us for hospice, and he was talking to her over the phone, but she perished before he even came down here. So that right there, it hurt him a lot. And when we went to the funeral, it's just, George just sat there at the casket over and over again. He would just say, mama, mama, over and over again. And I didn't know what to tell him because I was in pain too. We all were hurting. And he was just kissing her and just kissing her. He didn't want to leave the casket. And everybody was like, come on, it's gonna be okay. But it was just difficult because I don't know who can take that when you watch your mother, somebody who loved and cherish you and nourish you for your entire life, and then they have to leave you. We all have to go through it, but it's difficult. And George, he was just in pain the entire time.
Sir, you indicated your mother passed away May 30, that was 2018, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you described seeing your brother George at the funeral, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And was around the time of your mother's passing the last time you saw your brother George Floyd in person alive?
Yes, sir.
Did you maintain contact with him on the phone, through text and whatnot after that?
Yeah, we text, we called each other. He would call and I would call him, but we would talk a lot of times early in the morning because I was a truck driver. So he will always be up talking to me and getting pointers on how to back up, how to do this, shifting gears, different things like that. And I had great teachers, so I would also just explain to him what he needed to do, and that level to get to that next tier, that's what he would do. He would just listen, and he became a student, and I always had to ask him for advice because it was my big brother.
Sir, and this is a yes or no question, were you informed that your brother George Floyd died on May 26, 2020?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Any questions?
No, Your Honor, I have no questions for this witness.
All right, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here. And the next witness, please.
Let me make sure he's here, Your Honor. Is he here? Yeah. Thank you. Your Honor, the state calls Seth Stoughton.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Proceed, please.
Thank you.
And if you could remove your mask if you're comfortable doing so.
Yes, sir.
And let's begin by having you state your full name, spelling each of your names.
My name is Seth Wayne Stoughton, SETHWANE
Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Sir, how are you employed?
I am an associate professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law and an affiliate professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice.
How long have you been a law professor?
I've been there for 7 years now, almost 7 years, and 2 years prior to that in a teaching fellowship preparing to be a law professor.
Okay. And do you teach academic courses at the South Carolina Law School?
I do.
What courses do you teach?
I teach criminal law, criminal procedure, a regulation of vice seminar, and police law and policy.
Do you also conduct any scholarly research?
I do, yes.
What scholarly research do you conduct?
I study the regulation of policing and multiple aspects of the regulation of policing.
Okay. Now, I'd like you to please describe your educational background to the jury so they can understand how you come to be a law professor at the University of South Carolina. First, where did you receive your undergraduate education?
Florida State University in Tallahassee.
And what was your degree?
English, with a focus in literature.
And before we get into your law career, have you always been in academia?
No, I have not.
What was your prior career before becoming involved in academia?
I interrupted my undergraduate education to take a job as a police officer with the Tallahassee Police Department, and then later as an investigator with the Florida Department of Education's Office of Inspector General.
I'd like you to please describe for the jury your experience as an officer with the Tallahassee Police Department. First, what year did you join the department?
I applied to the department in 2000 and was employed in early 2001.
Okay. Can you describe for the jury the training process that you went through to become a police officer in the state of Florida?
Sure. So Florida has a academy requirement. I went to a regional police academy, which means not an academy run by my particular agency, but instead an academy that trains officers from a number of agencies in North Florida. After finishing the approximately 5.5 months or so of academy training, I went through additional pre-service training at my agency, about a month of classroom training and additional sort of lecture style training and hands-on training, and then went through 3.5 months of a field training program.
And after you completed your field training, you received an assignment as a law enforcement officer in Tallahassee.
Yes, I did.
I'd like you to please describe for the jury at kind of a high level the different assignments you had as a police officer with that department.
I was there full-time for just under 5 years. The entire time I was there, I worked on patrol. That was our uniformed capacity officers who were responding to calls for service or pulling over vehicles and the like. I had some additional assignments as a patrol officer. I spent about 2 years on our special response team. I taught community self-defense classes and child abduction and molestation prevention classes in the community and the like.
And as a patrol officer, were you ever in a situation where you had to use force on an individual?
Yes.
You ever have to arrest somebody?
Yes.
Handcuff a reluctant subject?
Yes.
Something that you would routinely do as a police officer?
Yes.
Did you respond to calls for service and write police reports?
Yes, lots of calls for service and lots of reports.
After you left the Tallahassee Police Department, you took a job with, was it the Department of Education?
Yes, Florida's Department of Education as an investigator in their Inspector General's office.
Please describe your general duties there.
So as an investigator, I was charged with investigating waste, fraud, and abuse within and affecting the Department of Education. The investigations were both administrative, for example, sexual harassment allegations, within the Department of Education, and also criminal, private school tuition voucher fraud primarily, although there were some other non-tuition voucher fraud criminal cases that I was involved in.
When did you decide to go to law school and enter law school?
Having put my undergraduate education on hold, as an investigator, I now had a regular day job, so I was able to finish that degree. It took me 10 years to get a 4-year degree because I can be a little slower than the average bear sometimes. As I was coming up on the end of that degree, we made the decision, my wife and I made the decision to go to law school to continue to expand career options.
Where did you attend law school?
The University of Virginia.
And what year did you graduate from law school?
2011.
And at what point did you enter academia generally?
I clerked for a year after law school. I worked for a federal judge based out of Indiana for the year after law school. I then began my academic fellowship after that clerkship.
And in your academic pursuits, did you decided to build on the experience that you had as a former police officer?
Yes.
And how so?
As I began law school, I really had no intention of becoming an academic. And I had some outstanding professors, and between their influence and my interest in studying policing from an academic and a legal perspective, I realized there was a little bit of a niche where I could draw on some of the information that I had from firsthand experience to either ask questions that other academics maybe had not asked, or to find answers in different places that other academics may not have thought to look.
And is that where you've focused your research?
Yes, all of my research has been on policing and the regulation of policing.
Have you authored any scholarly publications?
Yes.
And what sort of publications have you authored?
I have written law review articles, which is the type of academic journal that legal scholars publish in. I've written for a number of different publishers, a number of different articles on a range of topics, officers and off-duty employment, the use of force, tactics, different ways that aspects of our legal system regulate police officers and affect officer behaviors.
Have you authored chapters of books?
Yes, I have.
What books, what publications have you authored chapters of?
I think my most recent publication was in critical issues in policing. which is a series of contemporary essays on policing. That chapter is on the regulation of police violence. I've authored book chapters on police misconduct, and I'm authoring another one on use of force review right now.
You published a book recently, is that right? With you co-authored a book, is that right?
Yes, I did.
And what's the title of the book?
That's Evaluating Police Uses of Force.
All right. And you have a copy with you here.
I do.
You co-authored that book with Jeffrey Noble and Jeffrey Alpert, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So are you a member of any professional organizations?
I am, yes.
What professional organizations are you a member of?
I'm an associate member of the Virginia Bar, which is a non-practicing member of the State Bar Association for attorneys. I'm a member of the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing, a member of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. I serve as an advisor to the American Law Institute's Principles of the Law on Policing. I'm a member, or I believe technically a liaison, to the American Bar Association's Working Group on Trust in the Criminal Justice System. There are probably a couple of other ones. I don't remember them all offhand.
Do you occasionally provide consultation to law enforcement agencies in conducting use of force reviews through these organizations?
Not through the professional organizations, but I do work with, consult or do research with police agencies, yes.
Does that include providing educational instruction?
Yes.
Consultation?
Yes, it has.
And specific use of force reviews?
It has, yes.
And what agencies have you done that kind of work with?
I've done a training presentation to the training officers in the Richland County Sheriff's Office, which is, I believe, the largest law enforcement agency in South Carolina. I'm a member of the Civilian Advisory Council with my local police department, the Columbia Police Department. So I sit in what are called command review boards, which can involve assessing use of force in that context. I've done presentations and training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, which is not an agency per se, but the audience had representatives of a number of different state, local, and federal agencies. I've provided training and presentations to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives senior staff, to the command staff of the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. All of those are sort of formal. There might be a couple of others, as well as a range of informal consultations and discussions on a range of issues with a number of agencies.
And are you a frequent speaker or lecturer on issues of policing and uses of force throughout the country?
Yes, although in the past year most of those have been presentations from my home via Zoom, but yes, they are based all over the place.
What organizations do you present to?
I've presented well over 100 times at this point to organizations that include the American Judges Association, the Conference of Chief Justices, judicial conferences in a number of states, prosecution or defense conferences in a number of states, security conference in Mexico City, a prosecution and defense combined conference in Canada. Most recently, I've presented at several law reviews and symposiums, one hosted by the by Loyola University in Chicago. That was this past week, by the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology. That was the week before, I believe. By the University of Wisconsin, Plattsville. That was also in this past week.
Right. Have you previously been retained as an expert witness?
Yes, I have.
How often have you been retained as an expert witness?
I've been retained around 60 times at this point.
Okay. Have you testified as an expert witness before at a deposition?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Approximately how many times?
At deposition, I think over a dozen, pretty easily at this point, I believe.
And in those depositions, have you testified as an expert witness in the area of use of force?
Yes, tactics, use of force, police procedure, yes.
Have you testified at a trial before as an expert in use of force?
Yes, I have. Use of force, including tactics and use of force related issues, yes.
What courts have you testified in?
There was a federal court in North Carolina, a federal court in South Carolina, criminal court in Georgia. I think that's it for trial testimony. As you know, most of these, most cases don't actually make it to a trial.
Yep.
And you were talking about depositions. Those are civil cases, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right. Now, you've been retained in this matter to provide testimony regarding the use of force that occurred on May 25, 2020 in the matter of the death of George Floyd. Is that correct?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And having been retained, you charge a fee for your services?
For my time in review, yes.
All right. What is your fee, your hourly rate?
$295 an hour in this case.
And you receive a different rate for trial days?
I have a 8-hour minimum on days I'm expected to testify, yes.
Okay. And to date, how much have you been compensated based on your work in this case?
I would have to look at my records to see what actual compensation has been. In the area of maybe $24,000 or $25,000 received.
How many hours would you estimate that you've put into preparing for this matter?
Including both compensated and uncompensated hours, I'm probably in this might be overestimating slightly, but in the 130 to 140 hour range.
Now, in your experience as an expert witness, have you always reached a conclusion that's favorable to the party who hires you?
No.
Why is that?
Because the facts and my review of the facts did not favor them. So my credibility is very important to me, and if I am retained and develop an opinion that does not favor the attorney who retains me, that's still my opinion.
Now, did you actively seek to participate in this matter?
No.
Who contacted you?
The state of Minnesota.
Based upon in your retention with the state of Minnesota, have you developed opinions regarding the use of force against George Floyd on the date of his death?
Yes, and related activity, yes.
I'd like you to please explain to the jury first the process by which you go about reaching conclusions, analyzing cases such as this.
Sure. So the first step is to get and go through the material. In this case, I believe I got an external hard drive that had tens of thousands of pages of documentation. I believe close to or over 40,000 pages of documentation, a large number of videos, including a number of body-worn camera videos, including the body-worn camera videos of the officers who were involved in this particular incident.
Those would include the body-worn camera videos of the defendant, is that right?
Yes.
And Officer Tao, Officer King, and Officer Lane?
Yes.
Did you also review some bystander videos, Darnella Frazier, for example,
Yes, her video, Ms. Hansen's video, a video taken from across the street by a bystander, I think in a Speedway gas station, a traffic cam or a pole camera mounted somewhere up above. Yes, a number of videos. As an individual who frequently reviews uses of force, are you commonly called upon to review body-worn camera footage and other footage such as surveillance or bystander video? Yes. In fact, one of my academic publications is specifically about body-worn cameras, and I've done a great deal of both research and teaching on using video footage, interpreting video footage, especially in use of force cases. If you could please describe to the jury just I guess the depth of body-worn camera footage you were able to view in this case as compared to one in which you might have just a single recording. Yeah, sure. It's pretty common for a use of force to only involve an officer or two, to involve very limited video, maybe only the video from that particular officer. And body-worn camera or any video footage is just one more piece of evidence that I, in conducting a review, have to examine and weigh and measure against other pieces of evidence. In this case, unlike the vast majority of cases that I've been involved in, there were a whole bunch of videos. So videos from different perspectives of the same event that can allow a much more robust understanding of what was going on. To put it very simply, one camera only captures what's available on that camera, so I don't see what's happening off camera. But when I have multiple videos from multiple perspectives, multiple angles, it allows me to get a much better sense of what's happening when and where. So, using some examples, you examined the Frazier video, is that right? Yes. And you were also able to view the Alicia Finari, the Speedway employee's video as well, correct? Yes, that's correct. And then at the same time view the Milestone video, the larger overview. Yes, that's the pole camera video, I think on top or near the top of the Speedway. And can you describe to the jury the different perspectives that you were able to see using each of those videos and how the viewing of one aided the understanding of the other? Sure. So very simply, the Ms. Frazier's video was taken from the sidewalk near the squad, near the police vehicle. And you really don't see Officers Lane or King on that video. On the other hand, from the perspective across the street at the Speedway or the pole camera, you do see those officers. It's simply because the camera isn't obstructed by the police vehicle. Now, did you, upon your review of all the videos, the documents that you discussed, complete a report memorializing your findings? Yes, I did. My findings and opinions. About how long was that report? The report total, I believe, was close to 300 pages. That includes a rather lengthy appendix that lists out all of the materials that I reviewed. The body of the report itself, which has my summary of the relevant facts and my opinions, was, I think, about 112 pages. 110 pages if we take out the table of contents, maybe. Over 100 pages. All right. And did you rely on your training and your experience and academic experience to review the evidence in this case and reach your conclusions? Yes. And have you reached your opinions to a degree of reasonable professional certainty based on generally accepted standards in your field? Yes, I have. Now, before sharing those opinions, sir, I would like you to please explain what factors you review when you're evaluating uses of force. Sure. So first, as sort of a threshold point, I have to know what I'm actually looking at, right? I have to know which uses of force I'm actually reviewing. For example, if an officer is involved in a shooting, the saying is the officer has to account for every bullet that they put downrange. That is, they count as separate uses of force. After I identify what the uses of force are, then I apply essentially a four-step analytical framework. First, I identify what the relevant facts and circumstances are as viewed through the lens of a reasonable officer on the scene. Then I assess the threat, if any, presented by the individual's actions. Then I assess the foreseeable effects of the officer's use of force. And then the fourth step is sort of putting all of that together and assessing whether, in light of the facts and circumstances, the foreseeable effects of the officer's use of force were justified and reasonable because they were proportional and appropriate in light of the threat presented by the individual's actions.
By what standard are you making this assessment?
So the ultimate analytical question, that step 4, is applying generally accepted police practices, what we might call a national or professional standard for the way we expect and the way policing expects officers to engage with individuals and use force.
And what are these national standards based on?
So a combination of things. They're certainly influenced by constitutional law, for example, by history and research in policing. Since the 1970s or so, there's been tactical research within policing that's helped inform what we would now consider generally accepted practices, a great deal of evidence and experience as well.
Are there constitutional standards as well?
Yes, constitutional law, especially the Fourth Amendment standard, is one of the factors that defines or certainly influences generally accepted practices.
Is another influence a particular department's policies and training?
An agency's policies or training might, and indeed I would hope they are, reflective of the generally accepted practices, but we can't define industry-wide generally accepted practices by looking at a particular agency's policies or training.
So the standard you're reviewing is that of reasonableness?
That's correct. Now, we might look at a large number of agencies and say, okay, if hundreds or many, many police agencies are doing this thing, then maybe that's a best practice or a generally accepted practice. But you can't just look at one agency and say it's reasonable because this one agency said it was reasonable.
All right. When discussing the constitutional standards, you're familiar with the standards set forth in Graham versus Connor?
I am, yes.
And you have a demonstrative, I believe it's Exhibit 954. And if I could publish that, the Graham factors.
Okay. 954 is received for demonstrative purposes only.
Right. And can you just please tell the jury what it is you see here?
So this is a summary of what are referred to as the Graham factors. These are specific factors identified by the Supreme Court in the case Graham v. Connor that we use really in that second phase of analysis. And the second step, remember, is assessing the threat presented by the individual's actions. And to understand Graham v. Connor, kind of have to understand what we mean by threat. First, when we're talking about the threat that an individual may present, it's not some abstract notion. It's not general threat or conceptual. It's specific threat of something, right? Someone who's running away may present a threat of escape or a threat of assaulting an officer or the like. And further, we can define threat. We know that threat exists when the individual has the physical ability and the opportunity and the inherent intention to cause whatever specific harm we're analyzing. So, for example, imagine someone who's just standing there with nothing in their hands. They don't have the physical ability to hit an officer with a tire iron. So there's no threat that an officer is going to be hit with a tire iron. There's just no physical ability there. On the other hand, imagine someone who has a tire iron but who's 50 feet away. They have the physical ability because they have a tire iron, but they don't have any opportunity. They're too far away in that moment to actually present a threat. And then we could imagine someone who has a tire iron and they're 2 or 3 feet away from an officer, but they're changing a tire at the time. They have the ability and the opportunity, but there's nothing about that interaction, as the officer is talking with them, that suggests they have the apparent intention to cause that particular threat. So when you put all of those three things together, ability, opportunity, and intention, that's how we identify threat. The Graham-Connor...
I'd like you to contrast that with risk.
Oh, sure. So threat, as I've defined it, can be contrasted with risk. Risk you can think of as a potential threat. That person with the tire iron who's 50 feet away, they don't present a threat. If they get close enough, they might have the opportunity now, or the apparent intention, to strike an officer with the tire iron, but they don't yet. So risk is something that officers can use tactics and communication to help address. The goal is to prevent risk from becoming threat, and really to prevent threat from becoming whatever that relevant harm is. But while threat can justify use of force, risk can't. An officer can't use force on someone who's holding a tire iron and 2 or 3 feet away while they're just changing a tire, because there's no apparent intention, there's no threat there. The officer can do something like back away, build distance so they aren't 2 or 3 feet away, or interpose the vehicle between themselves and the individual they're interacting with, or use communications. They could ask the individual to put the tire iron down, but they can't use force there because there's no threat.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
This is what you get for having a law professor testify.
And they're trying so hard to take notes, and court reporters trying to take things down, so I'm going to slow you down a little bit, if I may, Professor.
Sure, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Then in assessing other potential risk factors, would you agree that the relative size of a person is a risk factor?
It's certainly a relevant consideration, yes.
But is it in and of itself a threat?
No, certainly not. Someone who's physically large may have a greater physical ability to inflict harm if they assault an officer, but that their size can't establish opportunity and can't establish intention.
And how about recent drug use? Is that a threat or a risk?
Again, it's a relevant consideration, but it does not in and of itself establish a threat. It doesn't establish physical ability by itself to do anything. It doesn't establish opportunity to do anything, nor does it establish apparent intention. So it's certainly a relevant consideration in the totality of the circumstances, but officers can't use force on someone just because they're on drugs.
Now, I'd like to talk about, or I'd like you to discuss the severity of the crime at issue. How is that relevant to the Graham analysis?
Sure. So as we're thinking about the concept of threat, the Graham factors really help us identify when there's a threat and how much of a threat. Severity of the crime can be best understood as a proxy for dangerousness. All other things being equal, an armed bank robber may be suspected to be more dangerous than someone who is cashing a worthless check, for example. So severity of the crime is really a proxy for evaluating how much risk someone might present, how dangerous are they.
And if we could go to the third factor then, the active resistance, whether they are actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. How is that relevant to your analysis?
So again, this is all part of that threat analysis, that second step in my framework. And this is getting at the behavior of the subject. So for example, someone who's attempting to evade arrest by flight is threatening the government's interest in apprehending that person. It's about identifying a threat of escape. Active resistance can be similar. It's a threat of someone frustrating the government's interest in taking them into custody, for example.
Are there different types of resistance?
Yes, absolutely.
What are the types, generally accepted definitions in policing as the different types of resistance?
Sure. So the concepts are certainly generally accepted, although some of the vocabulary differs from place to place. We might first identify someone who is compliant, who's doing what the officers want, no resistance at all, right? Then we might have someone who is passive or non-compliant. They're not doing what the officers want, but they're not doing anything against what the officers are telling them to do either. The classic example of passive resistance is someone who's just laying on the ground, refusing to get up when told. Then there's active resistance, which is typically defined as someone who is engaging their muscles in some way. Someone who's tensing up or someone who's running away is engaged in active resistance. Next level up, if we can say that, is active aggression. And this is where someone is not just engaging their muscles, they're engaging their muscles in a way that creates a threat of harm to the officers or someone else. And finally, the ultimate expression of active aggression is when a subject presents an imminent threat, again, as that term is defined, of death or serious bodily injury to officers or others.
If we can take that down, please. Now, I think we've gone through in a little more detail the first two steps of your four-step process. Talk about identifying facts that would have been apparent to a reasonable officer. You've discussed identifying threats. You also testify that you need to identify the foreseeable effects of the officer's actions. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. What I mean by the foreseeable effects of the officer's actions is essentially what is this use of force likely to do? Just as there's a spectrum of resistance from no resistance to a whole lot of resistance, right, threatening the life of an officer, there's also a spectrum of effects that we might expect from an officer's use of force. So, for example, some uses of force are relatively minor and unlikely to cause any more than temporary discomfort. Other uses of force are substantially likely to cause death or serious bodily injury, what we would refer to as deadly force. As you're analyzing use of force, it's very important to focus on the foreseeable effects of what the use of force involved, and not the actual effects, not what actually happened. And I can give you an easy example. If an officer shoots at someone, that's a use of deadly force because it's foreseeable that discharging a firearm at someone is going to cause death or serious bodily injury. And that's true even if the officer misses entirely, or if the bullet hits the person but causes a very superficial injury, let's say it just scrapes them. It's still a use of deadly force because of the foreseeable effects, not the actual effects. And that concept of foreseeable effect is what's foreseeable really at the time force is being used.
And Professor Soden, the fourth factor that you testified about, determining whether the officer's actions are appropriate, proportional, and reasonable. Can you please explain what you mean by appropriate, proportional, and reasonable?
Yes, so what we're talking about is sort of a balancing of harms here. This also pulls from Graham v. Connor and the Fourth Amendment standard, which talked about balancing the individual interest against the government interest. The idea is an officer cannot use more force than the situation justifies. That is, the foreseeable effects of the officer's use of force can't be disproportionate to the threat presented by the individual's actions.
And sir, did you take all of these factors into consideration in your performing your analysis in this case?
Absolutely, yes.
I ask if you assisted with the preparation of a demonstrative exhibit, demonstrative 953.
Yes, I did.
And would the use of that demonstrative exhibit assist you in explaining your analysis and testimony to the jury?
Yes, and especially how those factors apply.
Offer exhibit 953 for demonstrative purposes.
Any objection? 953 is received for demonstrative purposes only.
And before we publish that, first I'd like to publish what's been received as exhibit 17 and ask you, sir, if you identified in accordance with your process what particular force you evaluated. So if you would publish exhibit 17.
Yeah, so there are two components to the use of force here. The first is the defendant's knee or shin over Mr. Floyd's neck. The second is Mr. Floyd in that prone position while restrained, what I may refer to as prone restraint.
At this time, I'd like to publish exhibit 953. One moment, Your Honor. Did you also look at a demonstrative exhibit, Exhibit 949, that showed the relative position of the defendant and the other officers on Mr. Floyd?
Yes, I did.
All right.
And again, here you can see the two components of the use of force, the knee across Mr. Floyd's neck, as well as him being in the prone or face down position while restrained.
I'm offering Exhibit 949 for demonstrative purposes.
For demonstrative purposes.
949 is received for demonstrative purposes only.
And using what you saw as Exhibit 17, which has been received substantively in 949, again, explain what particular force you are analyzing and over what period of time.
Yeah, so again, both the prior image, the photograph, and this this demonstrative show the knee, the defendant's knee across the back of Mr. Floyd's neck, and Mr. Floyd face down in that prone position while handcuffed. The use of force here, use of force is not always a flash in the pan event. Firing a bullet might be, but other uses of force, including the uses of force in this case, are sustained. So they start when Mr. Floyd is put into the prone position and when the knee goes across the neck, and the uses of force continue until the knee comes off the neck and Mr. Floyd is taken out of that prone position.
And you indicated that the use of force included the defendant's placement of the knee on the neck. The other knee, where did that appear to be placed?
Yes, variously on Mr. Floyd's upper arm, shoulder, or upper back.
Okay.
I would put that for purposes I imagine we will discuss as part of holding Mr. Floyd in the prone position while restrained.
What was your determination of the duration of this restraint period?
From the time Mr. Floyd was initially placed in the prone position, 9 minutes and approximately 29 seconds until the knee was taken off of his neck and he was taken out of that prone position.
And did you determine this period of time based on your review of using Officer King's body-worn camera footage starting at 20:19:14 and ending at 20:28:43?
Yes, that's correct.
And is it your testimony that, according to national standards, the use of force must be reasonable when it starts, and it must continue to be reasonable during the entire duration?
Sustained. Rephrase.
And sir, can you make any comment about how long the particular use of force must be reasonable, as in the defined restraint period?
Yes, so a use of force that is sustained over a period of time does have to be reasonable at the time force is initiated. That is when force is first used and throughout the duration that that force is being used.
And I believe you testified that using and applying these national and constitutional standards is viewed through the eyes of what a reasonable police officer at the scene. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's part of the Graham v. Connor framework, as well as certainly has been adopted into generally accepted police practices.
So then, using your four-step analysis to identify relevant facts and circumstances that would have been apparent to a reasonable officer on the scene, would you please summarize for the jury, based on your review, what information would have been available to a reasonable police officer in the defendant's position prior to his arrival at the scene that day?
Yes. So the reasonable officer on the scene standard is an objective one. We don't just adopt an officer's idiosyncratic subjective perspective. We take the reasonable officer and put them into the actual officer's position and say, what would the reasonable officer have perceived, seen, heard, or believed? In this case, prior to the reasonable officer in the defendant's position arriving on scene, he would have been aware that there was a call, I believe, dispatched about counterfeiting, that the individual was described as possibly intoxicated. The individual later identified as Mr. Floyd was identified as possibly intoxicated, that two other officers had taken the call, had I believe, taken someone into custody and called Code 4, identified that they had the scene under control and did not need additional resources.
Now what I'd like to do is turning to the demonstrative 953. Right, you can see the beginning of this use of force evaluation, and you have this divided into different sections. Up top you have threat factors, at the bottom you have foreseeable effects of force, you have the defendant and his conduct up top, activity of Mr. Floyd on the bottom. Is that right?
Yes, the threat factors are really the behaviors of Mr. Floyd and whether they presented any threat. And the foreseeable effects of force are really about the effects of the use of force on Mr. Floyd. Yes.
Now, what I'd like to do at this time is show you a first clip. This is taken from what has been received into evidence as Exhibit 45, beginning at timestamp 2017-40. And you see on the demonstrative here, it says defendant arrives on the scene. I'd like to publish that clip first.
Adjust the chair.
You can't win, bro. You can't win. I'm not trying to win. Go on, get in the car then. I'll be on the ground, anything. Go on, get in the car. In the car. He know it. He know it, Mr. Officer. Y'all hear me? Don't do me like that, man. Please. Okay, can I talk to you, please? So you get in this car, we can talk. I am claustrophobic. I'm hearing you, but you're not working with me. God, I'm claustrophobic, man. Get in the car. Get in the car. Get me in the front. Please. No, you're not in the front. I'm claustrophobic, Mr. Officer. Get in the car. We're going to pull you in. Okay. I'm not a bad guy, man. Get in the car. I'm not a bad guy. You ain't going to win.
All right. Now, sir, this is taken from the perspective of the defendant's body-worn camera. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
What information would have been apparent to a reasonable officer based on the exchange we just observed?
So a reasonable officer in the defendant's position would have realized that Mr. Floyd was in handcuffs, would have realized that there were 2 MPD officers already on scene, along with 2 more now, the defendant and the officer that he arrived with, would have realized that there was what we might call a point of conflict between the officers and Mr. Floyd, who did not want to get into the back of the car. One of the things that signifies is generally that, generally that the individual has been searched. Typically, an officer is not going to load someone into a squad into the back of a car until after they've been searched. As I said, a reasonable officer would have seen that this appears to be a point of conflict, would have heard that Mr. Floyd was describing himself as claustrophobic, would have understood Mr. Floyd to be offering some alternatives, right? Laying on the ground or sitting up in the front of the car, as opposed to being put in the back of the car. In other words, the point of contention does not appear to be police custody, right? Mr. Floyd does not appear to be objecting to being kept in police custody, but instead to be objecting to being put in the back of a vehicle.
Now, you're aware that the officers attempted to place him in the back of the vehicle, and he was eventually taken back out of the back of the vehicle and into the street. Is that right?
Yes, there was some non-compliance initially, and then what we would describe as that active resistance, what appears to be physical engagement of the muscles in a non-assaultive or non-aggressive way, leading ultimately to officers' decision to take him out of the rear passenger side of the vehicle.
And so, in your view, a reasonable officer would not have perceived this as active resistance, as an act of violence, or active aggression, I should say.
That's correct. This does not appear to be active aggression in the sense that Mr. Floyd does not appear to have the intention to assault or attack the officers here. His efforts appeared aimed at not being in the back seat of the car.
Now I'd like to publish the second clip, clip 2, which is taken from Exhibit 43, which is Officer King's body-worn camera. And the footage begins at timestamp 20:19 and it's labeled Floyd placed prone. If you'd please publish that.
For what? Please, man. I can't fucking breathe. Here, come on out. Look at you. Thank you. Thank you. Get up off the ground.
Pause. All right. So we're paused here at Mark 2019-08. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, at this point, can you please describe what would have been apparent to a reasonable officer at the scene?
So, as you heard, Mr. Floyd has already said, I can't breathe, and as officers pull him out of the back seat of the car, again, that point of contention from earlier, you hear Mr. Floyd say, thank you.
And he is also appears to be handcuffed, is that right?
He is handcuffed, and I believe, although not entirely clear from this freeze frame, I believe the video will show that he's on his knees at this point.
If you'd resume playing the clip, please.
Yeah, on the ground. On the ground. Ah, my knees. Right. You got your restraint? Hobbled? Okay. I'll grab that.
All right. Now, from that segment that we just watched, clip 2, can you please describe what information would have been available to a reasonable officer in the defendant's position at that time?
Yes. So again, focusing on the threat analysis here in this step, Mr. Floyd remains handcuffed. He's put from his position on his knees, where he's said, thank you, and I appreciate that, having been taken out of the back seat of the car. He's originally pushed over onto his left side, sort of facing the car, and then rolled from his left side into the prone position, into that face-down position.
Now, prior to having him, I guess, first brought down to the ground, at the time he was placed on his knees, I believe you indicated that he said, I appreciate that, or thank you, something to that effect?
Yes.
All right. At that point, was it necessary for the officers to prone him?
No,
Why,
it was not.
Why not?
Again, looking at the threat analysis here, it's clear from the number of officers and Mr. Floyd's position, the fact that he's handcuffed and has been searched, he doesn't present a threat of harm. His actions don't indicate that he presents any threat of escape. And as he's saying thank you for being taken out of the backseat of the car, it would certainly suggest that the point of conflict that had provoked his resistance in the first place is over. It suggests a lack of intention. Given the range of other alternatives available to the officers, it's just not appropriate to prone someone who is at that point cooperative.
What is the purpose of placing someone in the prone position in accordance with generally accepted police standards?
Yes, the prone position is a very useful position in policing for getting control of someone for purposes of handcuffing them. Again, the prone position is just basically face down, right? Their chest, front of the hips, on the ground. When officers are struggling with someone, or when they're handcuffing someone who they anticipate struggling with, you'll often see officers put someone into that prone position for purposes of handcuffing, because it's very difficult for someone to fight or to resist as they're face down on the ground, especially once their arms are out at their sides. However, the prone position, as useful as it is for handcuffing, is supposed to be transitory. It's used for handcuffing, and then as soon as someone has been handcuffed, you take them out of that position for, I imagine, reasons that we'll discuss.
And the position that you take him out of and put him into, is that the side recovery position?
It is, yes.
If you could then, just recalling the clip we saw initially when Mr. Floyd was on his knees and he was brought to the ground, what position was he in initially?
So initially, as he's on his knees, when he's brought over onto his left side, that would be consistent with the recovery position, laying on his side with his legs either straight or bent.
And then from that, essentially what would be the side recovery position, he was actually brought into the prone position from the recovery position. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And at this point, or shortly after this point, the prone position, the prone restraint position begins. Is that right?
Yes, when he is put into that prone position, that's where I would say that the prone restraint begins. He is restrained and prone.
Now,
as well as the knee across the neck. These are really the two uses of force that I'm focusing on.
All right, and this is where you've indicated as the beginning of the restraint period. Is that right?
That's correct. That red line indicates where the prone restraint and the knee across the neck begins in that timeline.
Now, I need to ask you, at the time that he was placed prone, when this use of force was done, was Mr. Floyd a threat?
So again, threat is specific, but I don't see him presenting a threat of anything. He was not a threat of harm to the officers, even to the extent he had physical ability. He didn't have much in the way of opportunity to assault or harm the officers, and just as importantly, there's no specific and articulable facts that an officer, a reasonable officer in the defendant's position could use to conclude that he had the intention of causing physical harm to the officers or others. It's very clear that although he had legs, so I suppose he had the physical ability to run away, he does not have the opportunity to do so. And again, there's no facts from which we could assess any intention to escape, so no threat of escape. And really, in light of the situation, there's not even a credible threat of obstructing the investigation. With 4 officers in the immediate area and one more, I believe a park police officer maybe half a block away across the street, there are ample resources on scene to maintain control and custody of Mr. Floyd. 2 officers can stand with him, and the other 2 can go about doing the what was ultimately a forgery investigation.
And if we could go to the next clip, please. Right, and that clip is taken from what's been received as Exhibit 49, which is the body-worn camera of Officer Tao. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And it starts at 20:21:31. If we could publish that, please.
I can't breathe, man. Please. Please let me stand. No. Please, man, I can't breathe.
Can you please explain to the jury what you heard and saw in this clip that's relevant to your analysis?
Yes, so there are a couple of things. First, of course, you hear Mr. Floyd saying that he can't breathe. That will come up as we talk about the foreseeable effects of the use of force. You'll also hear the officers discussing and ultimately concluding that they aren't going to use the hobble restraint.
Did they discuss why they wouldn't use the hobble restraint?
You hear, yes, you hear one of the officers say because something like if we use the hobble, a sergeant's going to have to come.
Now, can you please tell the jury what generally how a hobble restraint system works and what it's for?
Yes, a hobble is used to limit the motion of someone's legs. So if they're kicking or flailing around with the legs, especially someone who's in, for example, the backseat of a police car who may be kicking out the windows or something like that. And essentially the hobble goes around the ankles and binds the ankles together and then is connected to a belt piece, sort of a component around the midsection to slightly bend the individual's legs. Historically, the legs used to be bent up behind someone. Think of laying on your stomach and then kicking your feet up towards your butt. The way hobbles are generally used now is the feet aren't behind the individual, they're just brought up. So the knees are kept in front of the body and brought up a little bit. Again, the point is just to make it much more difficult, if not impossible, for the individual to kick.
And what would a reasonable police officer on the scene use to determine whether a hobble restraint is appropriate?
So hobbles are generally appropriate when officers cannot effectively restrain someone using only handcuffs. When they have someone who is continuing to kick or flail or